teenager laughed, right there in court. While the victim's mother sobbed, clutching a photo of her dead son, this 17-year-old kid smirked like it was all a joke. His lawyer tried to stop him. The judge warned him, but he kept going, whispering to his co-defendant, both of them grinning like they'd already won. That's when the prosecutor stood up, held up a flash drive, and said, "Your Honor, the state would like to play the video now." The courtroom froze. Nobody knew what was coming, but in less than 1 minute, that smirk would be gone, because the voice they were about to hear wasn't a witness. It was his, laughing as a man died. If you believe karma is real, you need to see what happens next. Subscribe now and drop a comment with your thoughts, because this story will shock you. Let me show you how a teenager's own recording became the evidence that buried him. His name was Jesus Ayala, 17 years old, arrested for murder, sitting in a Nevada courtroom like he didn't have a care in the world. His passenger, 16-year-old Jesamir Keys, sat beside him, quieter but just as detached. The victim? Andreas Probst, 64, retired police chief, husband, father. A man who spent 3 decades protecting strangers, now reduced to a name on a court docket. On August 14, 2023, Andy went for a bike ride. It was a Sunday morning, sunny, peaceful, the kind of ride he'd done 1,000 times. But that morning, 2 teenagers had stolen a Hyundai, grabbed a phone, and decided to film their joyride. They weren't just looking for speed. They were hunting for content, for reactions, for something that would blow up online. When they spotted Andy pedaling ahead in the bike lane, one of them had an idea, a dare, a sick, twisted challenge that would end in death. The driver aimed the car. The passenger filmed. And when they hit him, when Andy's body flew across the road and crumpled on the asphalt, they didn't stop to help. They laughed, they kept filming, and they shared the video like it was a trophy. Andreas Probst wasn't supposed to be a victim. He was supposed to be the guy who stopped them. For over 30 years, he wore the badge, ran toward danger, and made split-second decisions that saved lives. He started as a beat cop in California, worked his way up through detective ranks, and eventually became police chief in Bell, a small city southeast of Los Angeles. He knew gang violence, domestic calls, traffic stops that went sideways. He'd seen the worst of humanity and still believed in the best. When he retired and moved to Las Vegas with his wife, Crystal, it wasn't to escape. It was to finally live. No more midnight calls. No more funerals for fallen officers. Just quiet mornings, coffee on the patio, and long bike rides through the desert landscape he'd grown to love. Andy was the kind of man who fixed things. Neighbors would see him outside at dawn, tightening a loose mailbox post or dragging someone's trash cans back from the curb after the wind knocked them over. He didn't make a show of it. He just did it. His daughter, who followed him into law enforcement, once told a colleague, "If everyone policed like my dad, we wouldn't be on the news so much." She meant it. He was patient where others were quick to anger, firm but fair. The kind of officer who'd rather de-escalate than dominate. In a profession that too often makes headlines for the wrong reasons, Andy Probst was a quiet reminder of what it was supposed to look like. He believed in structure, in rules, in the idea that society only works when people respect the invisible lines that keep chaos at bay. It's painful, then, to realize he was killed by 2 teenagers who thought those lines were a joke. His daily routine was simple and predictable, which is exactly how he liked it. Wake up before the heat set in, usually around 5:30 in the morning. Check the tires on his road bike, a sleek silver model he'd bought after retirement as a reward for decades of service. He'd kiss Crystal on the forehead, careful not to wake her, and slip out the front door into the cool desert air. The route he loved most wound through the residential sprawl of northwest Las Vegas, where stucco homes with terracotta roofs stretched toward the Spring Mountains in the distance. It wasn't scenic in the postcard sense, no forests, no coastline, but it had a stark, open beauty. Wide roads, long sight lines, room to think. He'd ride for an hour, sometimes more, legs pumping in a steady rhythm, mind nowhere in particular. At the end of every ride, he'd text his daughter the same message: "Home safe." It was a small ritual, born from years of knowing that the people who love cops never stop worrying. On the morning of August 14th, that text never came. What made Andy's murder so especially cruel was the contrast. Here was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to law and order, killed on a random Sunday by kids who treated the law like a suggestion. He had faced down armed suspects, walked into domestic violence scenes where anything could happen. Case stood on the thin line between order and chaos for 3 decades. And he survived all of it. He retired with commendations, respect, and the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. But he couldn't survive 2 bored teenagers in a stolen car with a phone and no conscience. There's a cosmic injustice in that. A man who ran toward danger for strangers, taken out by kids who saw danger as entertainment. His family would later say that the hardest part wasn't just his death, it was how casual it was. And he wasn't targeted because of who he was. He was targeted because he was there. A moving object, a potential viral moment. Nothing more. The neighborhood where Andy rode wasn't some high-crime area. It was the kind of place people moved to feel safer, away from the Strip's noise, away from the older, grittier parts of the city. New developments with names like Desert Bloom and Sunset Ridge sprouted across the valley, filled with young families and retirees looking for space and sun. But with growth came problems. Bored teenagers with too much time and not enough supervision. A surge in car thefts, particularly Kias and Hyundais, thanks to a viral social media challenge that taught kids how to hotwire them in under a minute. Local Facebook groups buzzed with complaints. Cars racing through stop signs, near misses with pedestrians. Ring camera footage of kids hanging out of windows, laughing and filming as they blew through red lights. Some residents called the police. Patrol cars would circle through, but by the time they arrived, the kids were gone, already posting clips with captions like, "Almost got caught LOL." There was a growing sense that the streets were slipping out of control, that the rules didn't mean what they used to. Andy, ever the optimist, believed it was a phase. Kids being dumb. They'd grow out of it. He had no idea that 2 of those kids were about to make sure he never made it home. The night before he died, Andy had dinner with Crystal, and they talked about visiting their daughter soon, maybe taking a trip to see the grandkids. He joked that he was in better shape now than when he was on the force. No donut runs, no sitting in a patrol car for hours. As they washed dishes together, he mentioned wanting to upgrade his bike, maybe get something lighter for longer rides. She teased him about turning into one of those serious cyclists, the ones in tight shorts and aerodynamic helmets. He laughed. Before bed, he laid out his cycling clothes on the chair in the corner of their room. Moisture-wicking shirt, padded shorts, gloves. His helmet hung on its usual hook by the garage door. Everything in its place, everything routine. Crystal would later tell the court that there was no sense of foreboding that night, no unease, no last-minute hug that lingered too long. It was just another evening in a long string of evenings in a peaceful retirement. That ordinariness would haunt her, because it meant there was no chance to say goodbye. No warning, just a kiss on the forehead and a closing door. While Andy set his alarm for another quiet ride across town, in a cluttered bedroom lit only by a phone screen, 17-year-old Jesus Isla scrolled through videos of stolen cars sliding through intersections, engines revving, tires smoking. He double-tapped clips of near misses with pedestrians, laughed at comments daring people to do it for real. His world was likes, shares, dares, a place where consequences were theoretical and content was king. He had no job, no structure, no one really watching. School was a joke he'd mostly stopped attending. The justice system? He'd been through it before. Slaps on the wrist, warnings, release back to the same environment. He told friends he wasn't afraid of jail because they treat you better inside than at home. It was bravado, but it was also belief. He genuinely thought the rules didn't apply to him. Tomorrow, his path and Andy's would cross for less than 3 seconds. One man who spent his life enforcing order. 2 boys who thought chaos was a game. The collision was inevitable, and when it came, only one of them would walk away. The other would become a statistic, a headline, a framed photo carried into a courtroom months later. The smirk Andy never saw was already forming. Jesus Ayala didn't wake up on August 14th planning to kill someone. He woke up bored. 17 years old, no school, she'd no job, no reason to be awake before noon, except that sitting still felt like dying. His childhood had been fractured, moving between relatives in and out of the system, a father mostly absent, a mother who tried but couldn't keep up. Teachers had given up on him years ago. Counselors wrote reports that went into files no one read. By the time he hit his teens, Ayala had learned that the loudest voice in the room gets the attention, and the most reckless person gets the respect. And he wasn't evil in the cartoon sense. He wasn't plotting violence in a journal or fantasizing about hurting people. He was something more common and maybe more dangerous, a kid so disconnected from consequences that other people stopped feeling real. To him, they were NPCs in a game, obstacles, content. He had a juvenile record, petty theft, vandalism, joyriding, but nothing that stuck. Every time the system slapped his wrist and sent him home. Every time. But he learned the same lesson. Nothing really matters. His best friend, or at least his most frequent accomplice, was Jesimir Keys. 16 years old, skinnier, louder, always the one holding the phone. If Ayala was the driver, Keys was the director. He loved reactions more than anything. Shock, fear, laughter, outrage. Didn't matter as long as it was big. He filmed everything. Fights at school, stolen cars, close calls with police. He narrated life like it was a reality show, and he was the star. Classmates remembered him as funny but cruel, the kind of kid who'd roast you until you cried and then post the video. He wasn't a leader. He was a hype man. He needed someone like Ayala to actually do the things he wanted to watch. Together, they fed off each other in the worst possible way. Ayala wanted to prove he was fearless. Keys wanted to prove he could capture it. They had no idea that the same phone that made them feel powerful was building a case file that would bury them both. Every clip, every laugh, every piece of evidence saved to the cloud like a time bomb waiting to detonate in a courtroom. The stolen car epidemic sweeping through Las Vegas in 2023 wasn't an accident. It was a trend. Specifically, a TikTok challenge that taught teenagers how to bypass the ignition systems in certain Kia and Hyundai models using nothing but a USB cable and a screwdriver. The videos were everywhere. Step-by-step tutorials set to trending music, our kids showing off their technique, stitching clips of joyrides through city streets. What started as a stupid prank in Milwaukee spread nationwide. Insurance companies panicked. Police departments issued warnings. And kids like Ayala and Keys saw opportunity. It wasn't just about stealing a car anymore. It was about the performance of stealing a car, filming it, posting it, racking up views. For them, Grand Theft Auto wasn't a felony. It was a genre. They weren't criminals in their own minds. They were influencers. Metro Police had been dealing with this for months, catching some kids, losing others, watching the same vehicles get stolen, crashed, abandoned, and stolen again. Officers warned that someone was going to die. Local news ran segments. Parents were urged to talk to their kids. But in group chats across the city, teenagers joked that the coverage was free promo. The warnings only made it cooler. On the morning Andy Probst kissed his wife and rolled his bike out of the garage, Ayala and Keys were already awake, prowling a neighborhood several miles away. They'd spotted a silver Hyundai Elantra parked on the street. No security system, no steering wheel lock. Easy target. Ayala had the screwdriver. Keys had the phone out, filming as Ayala popped the plastic casing off the steering column and jammed the tool into the ignition. The engine turned over. They both laughed, not out of joy, but out of the sheer thrill of getting away with something. Again. Keys filmed Ayala's grinning face, then panned to the dashboard as they pulled away from the curb, tires squealing just loud enough to feel dangerous. The city was still quiet. Most people were asleep or just waking up. The roads were empty, the sky soft with early light. Perfect conditions for chaos. They drove aimlessly at first, no destination, just movement, running red lights because they could, and swerving into oncoming lanes to see how close they could get. Keys kept the camera rolling, narrating like a sports commentator. "Yo, we almost hit that car. Watch this, watch this." The phone was always on, always recording, always hungry. As the minutes passed, the dares escalated. At first it was just speed. How fast can you take this turn? How close can you get to that mailbox? But boredom creeps in fast when you're chasing adrenaline. They needed something bigger, something that would actually get a reaction when they posted it. They'd already filmed near misses with other cars. They'd already run lights. What was left? According to later testimony and evidence pulled from the phone, they started talking about pedestrians. What if they got close to someone walking? What if they could make someone jump out of the way? It was a game of chicken, except the other person didn't know they were playing. At one point, they allegedly swerved toward a man walking his dog. The man yelled. They laughed and sped off. It felt good. It felt like power. That's the thing about escalation. It doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in one dare at a time until suddenly you're not just scaring people, you're hunting them. Then they saw him, an older man on a bicycle, riding in the designated bike lane along Tenaya Way, a wide multi-lane road on the northwest edge of the city. He was alone, moving at a steady, predictable pace, vulnerable. From inside the stolen Hyundai, Andy Probst looked small, just a silhouette in lycra and a helmet, pedaling along like he had every right to be there, which he did. But to Ayala and Keys, he wasn't a retired police chief. He wasn't a father or a husband. He was a target, a dare, a piece of content waiting to happen. One of them, later evidence would suggest it was Keys, said it out loud. Something like, "Yo, hit him." Not as a serious command, maybe as a joke, a test. But Ayala didn't hesitate. He didn't laugh it off or say no. He pressed the gas. The car accelerated. Keys kept filming. The camera pointed forward through the windshield, capturing the road, the lane markers, and the growing shape of a man on a bicycle who had no idea what was coming. The distance closed fast. 50 feet, 30, 20. And then Andy was right there, centered in the frame, his back to the car, his legs still pumping the pedals, still believing the world was a place where people followed rules. Ayala jerked the wheel to the right. The Hyundai swerved into the bike lane at full speed. There was no braking, no hesitation, just a deliberate turn toward a human being. The impact was instant. Metal hit metal, metal hit flesh. Andy's body launched forward off the bike, airborne for a sickening moment, then slammed into the asphalt with a sound that doesn't belong in the real world. His helmet flew off. His bike crumpled and skidded across the road. Inside the car there was a jolt, like hitting a speed bump too fast, and then the steering straightened out, and they were past him, speeding away. For a half second there was silence. Then laughter. Loud, shocked, disbelieving laughter. Key's voice, high and excited, saying something like, "Oh my God, we just hit him." Ayala laughing even harder, almost hysterical. Not panic, not horror. Celebration. The phone kept recording. It captured everything. The voices, the laughter, the moment two teenagers realized they'd just done something irreversible and decided it was funny. Behind them, on a sun-baked stretch of Nevada asphalt, Andreas Probst lay motionless, 70 feet from where he'd been struck, his bike twisted in the middle of the road, and the boys who killed him didn't even look back. The first person to see Andy's body was a woman driving to work. She came around a curve on Tenaya Way and saw something in the road, something that didn't belong. A twisted bicycle, a shape on the pavement. She slowed, her brain struggling to process what her eyes were telling her. Then she saw the helmet, cracked and lying several feet away. She saw the blood. She pulled over, hands shaking, and dialed 911. Her voice on the recorded call was tight, controlled, but you could hear the horror underneath. "There's a man on the road. I think he was hit by a car. He's not moving. Please hurry." The dispatcher asked if she could see the vehicle that hit him. She looked around. Empty road, no one waiting, no hazard lights, no driver standing by, panicking and apologizing. Just absence. Just a man alone on the asphalt and a bike that looked like it had been folded in half. The dispatcher told her to stay on the line. Help was coming. But even as she said it, the woman knew. You don't survive something like this. Paramedics arrived within minutes, dropping to their knees beside Andy's body, moving with practiced urgency. They checked for a pulse, tried to stabilize his neck, started chest compressions even though the injuries were catastrophic. One of them radioed back to dispatch, voice low and clipped, the kind of tone that tells you the outcome before the words do. They loaded him onto a stretcher and into the ambulance, sirens screaming as they raced toward the hospital. But it was already over. Andreas Probst was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Blunt force trauma, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. The kind of injuries you see in high-speed collisions, not bike accidents. The doctor who signed the death certificate would later testify that the force required to cause this level of damage was extraordinary. This wasn't a car that clipped him and panicked. This was a car that hit him at full speed, directly, with no attempt to brake. When the medical examiner's report would use the word intentional even before the police did. Back at the scene, Metro Police traffic investigators began the grim work of documenting everything. Yellow tape went up, blocking off 2 lanes. Orange cones marked where the bike had landed, where Andy's body had come to rest, where debris was scattered across a 100-foot stretch of road. They photographed tire marks, measured distances, collected fragments of bike frame and pieces of plastic from a broken taillight. A detective walked the road slowly, looking for skid marks, evidence that the driver had tried to stop. There were none. The tire track showed a smooth, deliberate curve from the travel lane into the bike lane, then back out again. No stuttering, no panic swerving. Just a clean arc toward the victim and away again. It painted a picture that made the investigators uneasy. This didn't fit the profile of a distracted driver who looked up too late. This fit something else, something darker. But at this stage, they didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe the driver was impaired. Maybe they fell asleep. Maybe it was a medical emergency. They'd seen stranger things. The lead investigator, a veteran traffic cop named Sergeant Collins, stood at the point of impact and looked up the road. Wide lanes, clear sight lines, good weather, no obstructions. If you were driving this road, you'd see a cyclist from hundreds of feet away. Plenty of time to move over, slow down, pass safely. There was no reason for this collision to happen unless the driver wanted it to happen. Collins had worked fatal accidents for 15 years. He'd seen drunk drivers, texting drivers, kids racing on residential streets. But this felt different. The way the car had aimed into the bike lane, the complete absence of braking, the fact that the driver fled without even slowing, it all pointed to intent. He made a note in his report. Possible deliberate act. Recommend homicide unit review. That note would sit in a file for 2 days before anyone acted on it. 2 days during which Ayala and Keyes were still free, still posting, still laughing about what they'd done. At first, the case was treated like a standard hit and run. Tragic, but not uncommon. Las Vegas sees dozens of fatal traffic accidents every year. Pedestrians hit in crosswalks, cyclists clipped by distracted drivers, drunk drivers plowing into stopped cars. It's a city built on excess and speed, and sometimes that combination turns deadly. The local news ran a brief segment that evening. Retired police chief killed while cycling, driver fled the scene, family asking for information. Andy's photo flashed on the screen, smiling, in uniform, a man who looked like everyone's dependable uncle. The anchor read the details with appropriate solemnity, then moved on to the next story. In living rooms across the valley, people shook their heads, muttered about how dangerous the roads were getting, and changed the channel. Nobody knew yet that this wasn't a tragedy. It was a murder. And the evidence was already spreading across social media, shared in private group chats, viewed by dozens of teenagers who thought it was just another wild video in a feed full of wild videos. Yet the break in the case came from an unexpected source. 3 days after Andy's death, a patrol officer named Martinez was scrolling through his phone during a lunch break when his younger cousin sent him a video. The message said, "Bro, is this real?" Martinez opened it. Shaky footage from inside a moving car. Teenage voices. Laughter. Then a cyclist appearing in the frame, growing larger, and a sickening thud as the car made contact. More laughter. Someone saying, "So we got him!" Martinez felt his stomach drop. He recognized the street. He'd driven to Niaway 1,000 times. He checked the date of Andy Probst's death and compared it to the metadata on the video. It matched. He immediately forwarded it to his sergeant with a single message. "You need to see this." Within an hour, the video was in the hands of the homicide unit. Detectives gathered in a conference room and watched it together. No one spoke during the playback. When it ended, one detective stood up and walked out, needing a moment. Another cursed under his breath. A third replayed it, isolating the audio, trying to identify the voices. This changed everything. They weren't looking for a driver who panicked and ran. They were looking for kids who hunted a man for sport and filmed it like a trophy. The video was grainy but detailed enough to be devastating. You could see the dashboard of the car. You could hear the engine revving. And you could see the road ahead and the cyclist in the distance, pedaling steadily. Then one of the voices, young, male, excited, said something close to, "Hit his ass." Laughter. The car accelerated. The camera angle bounced as the vehicle swerved right. The cyclist filled the frame. Impact. The phone jolted. Then more laughter, louder now, mixed with adrenaline-fueled expletives. The car sped away and the video cut off. Detectives played it again and again, each time noticing new details. A reflection in the windshield that might show a face. The angle of the sun suggesting the time of day. Background audio that could place the car in a specific area before the collision. But the most damning detail was simple. The intent was audible. This wasn't an accident captured on dash cam. This was premeditated violence, recorded as entertainment, narrated by the killers themselves. The detective in charge of the case, a 20-year veteran named Laura Chen, closed her laptop and looked at her team. "We're not calling this a hit and run anymore," she said. "This is murder." And they handed us a confession. The digital forensics unit took over a small conference room and turned it into a war room. Laptops, external monitors, charging cables snaking across the table. The video was already loaded on 3 different machines, each detective assigned a specific task. Enhance the audio, stabilize the visual, and extract every piece of metadata buried in the file. The lead tech, a quiet woman named Reyes, who'd spent a decade pulling evidence from phones and hard drives, scrubbed through the footage frame by frame. She noted the timestamp, the file format, the device signature embedded in the code. It had been recorded on an iPhone, likely an older model based on the resolution. It had been sent via a messaging app, probably Snapchat or Instagram, then screen recorded and forwarded again, or which is why the quality was degraded. But degraded didn't mean useless. Reyes zoomed in on reflections in the windshield, adjusted contrast levels, isolated specific moments. In one frame, you could see a hand on the steering wheel. In another, a sliver of a face in the rearview mirror. Small details that, individually, meant nothing. But together, they would build a portrait of the killers. The audio was even more valuable. Reyes ran it through filtering software to reduce road noise and isolate the voices. 2 distinct speakers, both male, both young, based on pitch and slang. One voice was more dominant, louder, the apparent narrator. The other was quieter but still present, offering encouragement, laughing at the right moments. Linguistics experts would later analyze speech patterns, but the detectives didn't need a PhD to understand what they were hearing. These were teenagers, local kids, based on the accent and slang, probably no older than 17 or 18, and they were treating a man's death like a punchline. One phrase kept standing out, repeated by detectives until it was burned into their memories. "Hit his ass," followed by laughter. That single sentence would become the anchor of the prosecution's case. It proved intent. It proved premeditation, even if only by a few seconds. It proved that what happened to Andy Probst wasn't an accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a choice spoken out loud, followed by action. While forensics worked on the video itself, detectives started tracing its path through social media. Who posted it first? Who sent it to whom? The officer who'd received it from his cousin provided the starting point. The cousin gave up the name of the person who'd sent it to him, a classmate at a local high school. That classmate, nervous and suddenly aware they might be connected to a murder investigation, handed over screenshots of the group chat where the video had first appeared. The original sender's username was visible, a handle that matched other accounts across Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. Detectives started pulling profiles. One account, belonging to a user who called himself Jay Hustles, was packed with videos of stolen cars, joyrides, near misses with pedestrians. The bio bragged about being untouchable. The slang, the tone, the bravado, it all matched the voice on the murder video. Detectives ran the username through databases and cross-referenced it with known juvenile offenders. A name popped up: Jesus Ayala, 17 years old, multiple priors, last known address in North Las Vegas. Finding Ayala's identity unlocked the rest. His social media was public, a gallery of self-incrimination. Photos of him posing in cars that didn't belong to him. Videos of reckless driving with captions like, "Who's gonna stop me?" Comments from friends daring him to go faster, get closer, do crazier stunts. And in several videos, a familiar face appeared beside him. A thinner kid, always holding the phone, always narrating. Detectives zoomed in on tagged accounts and found him. Jazamir Keys, 16 years old. His profile was even more explicit. Dozens of videos filmed from the passenger seat of stolen cars, his voice providing play-by-play commentary. In one clip, he filmed Ayala swerving toward a jogger, cackling as the person jumped out of the way. In another, he bragged about how many close calls they'd had, how the cops couldn't catch them. These weren't just stupid kids making bad choices. These were repeat offenders documenting their crimes and treating the evidence like a highlight reel. Detective Chen stared at their mugshots from previous arrests, Ayala's defiant stare, Keys' smirking grin, and felt her jaw tighten. "They thought they were invincible," she said to her partner. "Let's show them what happens when you're not." With names in hand, the next step was building an airtight case before making arrests. Chen didn't want to spook them or give them a chance to destroy evidence. A warrant was drawn up to seize both teens' phones, social media accounts, and any devices that might contain the original video file. Detectives also located the stolen Hyundai. It had been abandoned 2 days after the crash in a grocery store parking lot, wiped down, but not well. Forensic teams found fingerprints on the steering wheel and door handle. Paint transfer on the front bumper matched the color of Andy's bike. Tire treads matched the marks left at the scene. Every piece of physical evidence lined up. But the crown jewel was still the video. Even if Ayala and Keyes wiped their phones, even if they deleted every account, the video had already been shared too many times. It lived on other people's devices now, on cloud servers, in screenshots and screen recordings scattered across the internet. They couldn't take it back. And that was their fatal mistake. On August 22nd, 8 days after Andy's death, Metro Police moved in. Ayala was arrested first, picked up at a relative's house in the early morning hours. Officers knocked, announced themselves, and found him asleep on a couch. The phone still in his hand. He barely reacted when they cuffed him, still groggy, still not understanding the weight of what was coming. In the patrol car on the way to the station, body camera footage allegedly captured him laughing, making jokes to the officers about how he'd be out soon. "I'm a minor," he reportedly said. "They can't do anything to me. I'll be home in a few days." One officer, a veteran who'd worked with Andy Probst years ago during a joint task force, unbit his tongue and said nothing. He knew what Ayala didn't, that the district attorney was already preparing to charge him as an adult, that the video was sitting in an evidence locker, waiting to be played in front of a judge, that the smirk on this kid's face was about to be wiped away in the most permanent way possible. Keyes was arrested an hour later at his mother's apartment. Unlike Ayala, he seemed to grasp the seriousness immediately. He didn't crack jokes. He didn't smirk. He cried. And he asked if he could call his mom. Officers allowed it, and the call was recorded. Keyes sobbed into the phone, saying he didn't mean for anyone to die, that it was supposed to be a joke, that he didn't think Ayala would actually do it. His mother's voice on the other end was frantic, asking what happened, what he'd done. He couldn't explain. He just kept saying, I'm sorry, over and over. But sorry doesn't rewind time. Sorry doesn't bring back a retired cop who kissed his wife goodbye and never came home. At the station, both teens were separated and placed in interrogation rooms. Detectives laid out what they had: the video, the stolen car, the physical evidence, the social media trail. Ayala stayed silent, arms crossed, staring at the wall. Keyes wavered, started to talk, then asked for a lawyer. Both were formally booked on charges of murder, grand theft auto, and leaving the scene of a fatal accident. In their mugshots were taken, Ayala still defiant, Keyes red-eyed and shell-shocked, and within hours, those images were online, paired with news stories about the retired cop and the viral video. The public's reaction was immediate and furious. The backlash came in waves. First, local outrage. Then, national attention. Cable news picked up the story, showing Andy's smiling photo next to the cold, indifferent faces of his killers. Comment sections exploded with rage. On calls for the harshest possible punishment, debates about whether 16 and 17 was old enough to understand murder. Victim advocacy groups rallied around the Probst family. Cycling communities across the country shared Andy's story, demanding safer roads and harsher penalties for drivers who target vulnerable road users. But the most shocking reaction came from other teenagers. Some defended Ayala and Keyes, claiming they were just kids, that it was a prank gone wrong, and that charging them as adults was unfair. Others shared the video not to condemn it, but to joke about it, to remix it with memes and music. That response horrified parents and investigators alike. It revealed a subculture where cruelty had been so normalized, so gamified, that even a filmed murder could be treated as content. Detective Chen did an interview with a local station, her voice tight with controlled anger. "If your child thinks this is funny," she said, "be looking directly into the camera, you have failed as a parent." The clip went viral, and the case, already explosive, became a lightning rod for a culture war about accountability, youth violence, and the role of social media in shaping monsters. The decision to charge Ayala and Keyes as adults didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a conference room on the 8th floor of the Clark County District Attorney's Office, where prosecutors, victim advocates, and senior detectives debated for hours over what message this case would send. On one side of the table sat the arguments for juvenile court, brain development science, rehabilitation potential, the idea that society has a responsibility not to throw away children, even children who do monstrous things. On the other side sat a flash drive containing a video of two teenagers laughing as they murdered a man. The DA, a career prosecutor named Stephen Wolfson, played the video one more time. He watched the faces of everyone in the room as the audio filled the space. The laughter, the dare, the impact. When it ended, he closed his laptop and said, "If we don't charge them as adults, we're telling every kid with a phone that murder is just a really bad prank. I'm not willing to do that." The room went quiet. Then, one by one, people nodded. The decision was made. On August 25th, the DA held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and members of the Probst family sitting silently in the back row. Wolfson stood at the podium, flanked by American and Nevada flags, his expression carved from stone. He began by acknowledging Andy's service, his character, the hole his death had left in his family and the community. Then his tone shifted. "This was not a traffic accident," he said, enunciating every word. "This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate, intentional act of violence, recorded and celebrated by the perpetrators. Jesus Ayala and Jesimir Keyes are being charged as adults with open murder, meaning the court will determine whether this constitutes first-degree or second-degree murder. They are also charged with grand larceny auto and failure to stop at the scene of an accident resulting in death." The room erupted with questions. Reporters shouted over each other. "How old are they? Will they face life in prison? What about the video?" Wolfson raised a hand. The video will be part of the evidence presented to the court. I've seen it. It is disturbing, it is graphic, and it leaves no doubt about intent. These defendants thought filming their crime made them powerful. Instead, it made our case airtight." The announcement divided the community immediately. Victim advocacy groups and law enforcement unions praised the decision, calling it long overdue accountability in a city plagued by juvenile car theft and reckless violence. Retired officers who'd worked with Andy released statements supporting the charges, saying he deserved nothing less than full justice. But public defenders, juvenile reform advocates, and some civil rights organizations pushed back. They argued that charging children as adults, regardless of the crime, was a failure of the system. They pointed to research showing that adolescent brains lack fully developed impulse control, that environments of poverty and trauma create pathways to violence, so that the justice system should prioritize rehabilitation over retribution. Op-eds appeared in local papers with titles like "They're Still Kids" and "When Does Punishment Become Revenge?" The debate raged on talk radio, in church basements, on social media. Everyone had an opinion, but only one opinion mattered legally, and that belonged to the judge who would oversee the case. Behind the scenes, the Probst family was being prepared for what came next. Victim advocates sat with them in quiet rooms, explaining the legal process, the timelines, the likely outcomes. They were warned that the video would be played in court, that they would have to sit through it, possibly multiple times. that the defense attorneys would try to humanize the defendants, paint them as misguided children rather than killers. Andy's daughter, Taylor, who'd followed her father into law enforcement and now worked as a detective in California, he struggled with the question of whether to watch the video before the trial. She'd been offered the chance privately. Part of her wanted to see exactly what happened to her father. Part of her knew that once she saw it, she could never unsee it. She asked the prosecutor, "Will it help? Will watching it make a difference in court?" The prosecutor was honest. "No, your presence makes the difference. Your words make the difference. The video speaks for itself." Taylor decided not to watch it. She would hear it in court when the time came. That was enough. That was already too much. The defense teams for Ayala and Keyes began building their strategies separately, knowing that their clients' interests might diverge. Ayala's attorney, a public defender named Marcus Levin, faced an uphill battle. His client had been the driver. His voice was on the tape. His social media was full of prior bad acts. Levin's only real angle was mitigation. Argue that Ayala's background, his trauma, his age, his underdeveloped brain should weigh in favor of leniency. Not innocence. He couldn't argue innocence. But maybe he could argue for a sentence that allowed for eventual release rather than life without parole. Keyes' attorney took a slightly different approach. Yes, Keyes was in the car. Yes, he filmed it. But he wasn't driving. He didn't steer the car into Andy. And his voice on the tape, while encouraging, could be framed as reactive rather than commanding. Maybe, the defense suggested, Keyes was a follower swept up in Ayala's recklessness. Maybe he didn't think Ayala would actually do it. It was a thin thread, but it was all they had. Both attorneys knew the video was the elephant in the room. They couldn't make it go away. They could only try to reframe it. Preliminary hearings began in September. The courtroom was smaller than the trial court would be, but still packed. Reporters lined the back row. Sketch artists sat with charcoal and paper, and since cameras weren't allowed inside yet. Ayala and Keyes were brought in separately, both in orange jumpsuits, hands cuffed in front of them. Ayala walked with his head up, scanning the room like he was taking inventory. Keyes kept his eyes down, shoulders hunched. The judge, a no-nonsense veteran named Tierra Jones, took the bench and immediately set the tone. "This is a courtroom, not a social media platform," she said, looking directly at the defendants. "Every action you take, every expression on your face will be noted. If you cannot conduct yourselves with respect for these proceedings, you will be removed. Am I understood?" Both mumbled, "Yes." Judge Jones was not satisfied. "Louder." They repeated it, louder this time. The Probst family sat 3 rows back, stone-faced, watching every movement. This was their first time seeing the boys who killed Andy in person. Taylor later described the moment as surreal. "They looked so young," she said. That's what made it worse. They looked like kids I'd try to help, and they killed my father for fun." The prosecution laid out a summary of the evidence: the video, the stolen car, the forensic match, the social media trail. They played a brief, silent clip of the video, just enough to show the judge what they were working with, not enough to traumatize the family unnecessarily at this stage. Even without sound, the impact was visible. The judge's face hardened. She leaned forward slightly, watching the cyclist appear and then disappear from the frame. When it ended, she sat back and was silent for a long moment. Then she denied bail. "The evidence suggests a deliberate act of violence with no regard for human life," she said. "Combined with a history of reckless behavior and flight risk, I see no reason to grant release." Ayala's attorney objected, citing his client's age and lack of prior violent offenses. Judge Jones cut him off. "Counselor, we just watched your client aim a car at a human being. Age is not a magic shield. Motion denied." Ayala's face twitched, maybe anger, maybe the first flicker of understanding that this wasn't going to go the way he thought. Keys, meanwhile, looked like he might be sick. His mother sobbed quietly in the gallery. The hearing ended, and both teens were led back to juvenile detention, though it was clear they wouldn't be there long. Transfer to adult county jail was imminent. As the case moved toward trial, media coverage intensified. Nancy Grace covered it. Dr. Phil covered it. True crime. YouTubers analyzed every frame of the video, every post on Ayala's Instagram, every comment Keys had left on stolen car videos. The Probst family tried to avoid the noise, but it was everywhere. Friends sent them links. Strangers recognized them in grocery stores and offered condolences or opinions. Some said the boy should get life. Others said the system was racist, that white kids wouldn't be charged the same way. The family tried not to engage. Andy's wife, Crystal, released one statement through the DA's office. "My husband believed in justice, not revenge. But justice requires accountability. These boys made a choice. Now they have to live with it." The statement was measured, graceful even, but those close to the family knew the rage underneath. The sleepless nights. Of the moments Crystal would walk into the garage and see Andy's bike still hanging on the wall and have to leave before she broke down. Justice wouldn't bring him back. But it was the only thing left to fight for. The trial date was set for late October, but the hearing that would define the case came earlier, in a pre-trial motion hearing on October 5th. The prosecution wanted to admit the full video into evidence. The defense, predictably, objected. They argued it was prejudicial, that its emotional impact would outweigh its probative value, that the jury, or in this case, the judge, since both defendants had waived their right to a jury trial in hopes of leniency, would be so horrified by the laughter that they'd lose sight of mitigating factors. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Elena Vargas, stood and delivered a rebuttal that would later be quoted in law school classes. "Your Honor, the defense claims this video is prejudicial. They're right. It is. It's prejudicial to their clients because it shows exactly who they are. It shows intent. It shows depravity. It shows a complete absence of remorse. If we can't show a jury what actually happened because it makes the defendants look bad, then we've lost the entire point of evidence. This isn't a reenactment. This isn't testimony that can be impeached. This is them, their words, their laughter, their crime." Judge Jones took less than 5 minutes to decide. "The video will be admitted. We will play it in full during the evidentiary hearing. Clear the gallery of minors. Victim advocates, please prepare the family. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. When the courtroom reopened, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier. Reporters who'd been chatting quietly before were now silent, pens ready. The Probst family sat together in the front row, Taylor in the middle, flanked by her mother and an aunt. Crystal clutched the framed photo of Andy in his cycling gear, the one that had become synonymous with the case. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the defendants. Ayala and Keys sat at separate defense tables now, their cases being handled together, but with distinct legal arguments. Ayala leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to project indifference. Keys sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, face pale. The bailiff dimmed the light slightly. A large monitor was wheeled to the center of the room, angled so the judge, the attorneys, and the family could all see. The prosecutor stood beside it, remote in hand. "Your Honor," she said, "this is the video recovered from the defendant's social media accounts and corroborated by metadata, forensic analysis, and witness testimony. It is approximately 45 seconds long. I'll play it now." She pressed play, and the room filled with the sound of teenage boys laughing. The video started mid-drive. The camera was pointed through the windshield of the stolen Hyundai, showing a wide, empty road under a bright morning sky. You could hear the hum of the engine, the wind through an open window. Then a voice, Key's voice, high and excited, said something like, "Yo, there's someone up there." The camera zoomed in slightly. Digital zoom, shaky. A figure appeared in the distance. A cyclist, alone in the bike lane, pedaling steadily. The car accelerated. You could hear it in the engine's pitch, feel it in the way the background blurred. Another voice, Ayala's, deeper, more controlled, said something that sounded like, "Watch this." Then Key's again, almost gleeful. "You gonna hit him? Yo, hit his ass." Laughter, not nervous laughter, not uncomfortable laughter, the kind of laughter you hear at a party when someone's about to do something wild and everyone knows it. The car swerved right. The cyclist grew larger in the frame, close enough now to see his helmet, his lycra jersey, the motion of his legs. Then impact. A sickening crunch. Yeah, the camera jolted violently, the image blurred, and then, as the car straightened and sped away, the laughter exploded. Louder, uncontrollable. Key's voice, breathless. "Oh my God, we hit him! We really hit him!" More laughter. Ayala's voice almost proud. "I told you." The video ended. The screen went black. The courtroom was silent. No one moved. Judge Jones sat perfectly still, staring at the blank monitor. The prosecutor placed the remote down gently, she as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment. In the gallery, Crystal Probst's shoulders shook. She pressed the photo frame against her chest and bent forward, sobbing quietly. Taylor wrapped an arm around her mother, her own face twisted in a grimace, tears streaming. Other family members wept openly. A victim advocate sitting nearby offered tissues, her own eyes red. Across the room, a reporter wiped her face with the back of her hand. Even the bailiff, a stone-faced veteran who'd seen 1,000 courtroom horrors, looked away and swallowed hard. The only people not visibly affected were Ayala and Keyes. Ayala stared at the table in front of him, jaw tight, expressionless. Keyes had his head in his hands, but it was impossible to tell if he was crying or just hiding. Judge Jones finally spoke, her voice low and edged with something that sounded like restrained fury. "Let the record reflect that the court has reviewed the video evidence in full. I will note for the record that the audio clearly captures premeditation and intent, as well as celebratory behavior following the act. This is not a case of reckless driving. This is murder." She paused, looking directly at Ayala. "And you, Mr. Ayala, seem remarkably unbothered by what we just watched." Ayala met her gaze, but said nothing. His attorney, sensing disaster, stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client is processing a very difficult situation. On his demeanor should not be—" Judge Jones raised a hand. "Counselor, sit down. I've been on this bench for 19 years. I know the difference between shock and indifference. Your client is indifferent." She turned to Keyes' attorney. "Does your client wish to make a statement at this time?" Keyes' lawyer shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Judge Jones nodded. "Then we'll move forward. The video is admitted into evidence. I want both defendants to understand something." She leaned forward slightly, speaking directly to the two boys. "You recorded your own crime. You laughed at a man's death. You shared that video like it was a trophy. You handed me a window into who you are. And what I see is not immaturity or poor judgment. What I see is cruelty. Conscious, deliberate cruelty. That will be reflected in sentencing." Ayala's face twitched. For the first time, something that looked like fear flickered in his eyes. Keyes openly cried now, shoulders shaking, hands covering his face. But the judge called a recess. As the defendants were led out, Ayala glanced back at the gallery. His eyes landed on Crystal Probst. She stared back, unflinching, still holding Andy's photo. He looked away first. Outside the courtroom, the Probst family gathered in a victim services room, trying to compose themselves before facing the cameras waiting in the hallway. Taylor sat with her head against the wall, eyes closed, replaying the audio in her mind. "I heard him die," she said quietly. I heard the moment it happened, and they laughed." Her mother reached over and took her hand. "He wouldn't want us to fall apart," Crystal said, though her voice shook. "He'd want us to stand up there and make sure everyone knows what they did." So they did. 10 minutes later, they walked out into a hallway packed with reporters and cameras. Taylor stepped up to a cluster of microphones, her mother beside her, and delivered a statement that would be replayed on every major news network that night. "My father was a good man, a protector, a servant, and he was murdered by 2 teenagers who thought his life was a joke. We just watched the video. We heard them laugh. If you think that's just kids being stupid, you're wrong. That's evil, and evil deserves consequences." She didn't take questions. She didn't need to. The message was clear. The video's public release was inevitable. Despite the court's attempts to keep it sealed, portions of it leaked online within days. Redacted, blurred versions appeared on true crime forums and YouTube breakdowns. Some platforms removed it immediately. Others left it up, citing public interest and freedom of information. The debate raged. Should the public see evidence this disturbing? Does exposing it serve justice, or just feed a culture of voyeuristic violence? Andy's family opposed its release, arguing that it turned his final moments into entertainment, exactly what Ayala and Keyes had intended. But once something is online, it's forever. Thousands of people watched it, shared it, commented on it. Some expressed outrage and sorrow. Others made jokes, remixed it with music, turned it into memes. That second group, the ones who found humor in a man's death, proved the Probst family's point. This wasn't just about 2 boys. It was about a culture that had normalized cruelty, a gamified violence and rewarded depravity with likes and shares. Andy's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. In the days following the video's admission into evidence, public pressure on the DA's office intensified. Victim advocacy groups demanded the harshest possible sentence. Families of other hit-and-run victims came forward, sharing their stories, demanding reform. Cyclists across the country staged memorial rides in Andy's honor. Hundreds of riders moving in silent procession through their cities, carrying signs that read, "Justice for Andy," and "Our lives are not content." Meanwhile, a smaller but vocal group protested outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Kids make mistakes," and "Rehabilitation, not incarceration." Tensions flared. Shouting matches broke out. Police had to separate the groups. The case had transcended the courtroom. It had become a cultural flashpoint, a Rorschach test for how society views youth, violence, accountability, and mercy. Everyone had an opinion, but in the end, only one opinion would matter, and Judge Tiara Jones had made hers very clear. Court-ordered psychological evaluations are standard in cases where defendants are minors charged as adults. The goal is to assess cognitive function, emotional development, trauma history, and capacity for rehabilitation. Both Ayala and Keyes were sent to separate forensic psychologists, doctors who specialize in evaluating criminal defendants. The sessions took place over several weeks in small, sterile rooms inside the juvenile detention facility where they were being held. Each boy sat across from a psychologist with a clipboard, answering questions about their childhood, their family, their understanding of right and wrong. The psychologists weren't there to judge. They were there to document, to map the interior landscape of 2 teenagers who had turned murder into a game. What they found was troubling, but not in the way the defense had hoped. These weren't boys who didn't understand what they'd done. They were boys who understood perfectly and did it anyway. Ayala's evaluation painted a picture of a young man with significant behavioral issues but no diagnosable major mental illness. He scored within the normal range on cognitive tests. He understood abstract concepts like mortality, consequence, and empathy. He simply chose not to apply them. And the psychologist noted a pattern of conduct disorder stretching back to early adolescence. Lying, theft, aggression toward peers, cruelty to animals. His home life had been unstable. Yes, his father was absent. His mother struggled with addiction. He'd moved between relatives, spent time in group homes, been expelled from multiple schools. All of that was true, but the psychologist also noted that Ayala displayed a lack of remorse that went beyond normal teenage bravado. When asked how he felt about Andy's death, he shrugged. When asked if he'd do anything differently, he said, "I wouldn't have posted the video. Not, I wouldn't have hit him. Not, I wish I could take it back. Just regret about getting caught." The psychologist's conclusion was damning. Ayala understood that killing someone was wrong, but his desire for status and excitement outweighed his moral reasoning. In clinical terms, he demonstrated antisocial traits with low empathy and high impulsivity. In layman's terms, he was dangerous. Keyes's evaluation was slightly more complex. He also tested in the normal range cognitively, but his emotional responses were more volatile. He cried during several sessions. He expressed guilt, though the psychologist noted it was often framed in terms of how the crime had affected his own life, rather than Andy's family. "I ruined my future," he said more than once, and not "I took someone's father." The psychologist diagnosed him with adjustment disorder and possible depression, exacerbated by the stress of incarceration and the weight of the charges. His childhood had been similarly unstable: poverty, inconsistent parenting, exposure to violence. But again, thousands of kids grow up in those conditions and don't film themselves committing murder. The evaluation acknowledged that Keyes was likely a follower, someone who craved approval and validation, and especially from more dominant personalities like Ayala. But it also noted that he was an active participant. He encouraged the act. He filmed it. He laughed. And critically, he shared the video afterward, which suggested pride rather than horror. The psychologist concluded that while Keyes showed more emotional capacity than Ayala, his moral compass was equally broken. He knew right from wrong. He just didn't care enough in the moment to stop it. And the defense teams tried to use these evaluations as mitigation. They highlighted the trauma, the instability, the brain development science, showing that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and long-term thinking, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about how adolescent brains are wired for risk-taking, peer influence, and immediate gratification. All of this was true. Neurologically, teenagers are different from adults. But the prosecution had a rebuttal, and it was simple. Most teenagers don't kill people. Most teenagers, even those with trauma, even those seeking thrills, stop short of aiming a car at a human being. The brain science explained susceptibility to bad decisions. It didn't explain this decision, and it certainly didn't explain the laughter. Prosecutor Vargas stood during cross-examination of the defense's neuroscience expert and asked a single question. "Doctor, does an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex prevent a 17-year-old from knowing that killing someone is wrong?" The expert hesitated. "No, it doesn't prevent knowledge. It affects judgment in high-emotion situations." Vargas nodded. So they knew, they just didn't care. The expert had no rebuttal. Behind the scenes, the prosecution was building a narrative that went beyond the crime itself. They wanted the judge to see a pattern. And they compiled evidence of Ayala and Keyes's behavior before Andy's death: the near misses with pedestrians, the bragging on social media, the escalating dares. They showed posts where Ayala joked about running people over. They showed comments where Keyes egged him on, calling him a coward if he didn't get closer. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was the culmination of months, maybe years, of treating human beings like obstacles in a video game. The prosecution also highlighted their behavior after the crime. Neither boy showed remorse in the days following. They didn't turn themselves in. They didn't confess to friends or family. They celebrated. Ayala allegedly bragged to other inmates while in juvenile detention, saying things like, "I'm famous now and everyone's talking about me." Keyes was quieter, but intercepted jail calls showed him complaining about being caught, not about what he'd done. But every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. These weren't children who made a tragic mistake. These were predators who got sloppy. The Probst family, meanwhile, was preparing their victim impact statements. These would be their chance to speak directly to the judge before sentencing, to put a human face on the name in the case file. Taylor worked on hers for weeks, rewriting it over and over, trying to find words big enough to contain the loss. And how do you summarize a father in a few minutes? How do you explain the absence he left behind, the holidays he'll miss, the grandchildren he'll never meet, the quiet moments when you reach for your phone to call him and remember he's gone? She settled on something simple. She would talk about who he was, not just what was taken. She would remind the court that Andy Probst wasn't a statistic. He was a man who spent his life protecting others, who believed in second chances but also in consequences, who would have wanted justice, not revenge, but justice all the same. Crystal's statement was shorter, more raw. She planned to look directly at Ayala and Keyes and tell them what they'd stolen. Not just a husband, but a future. Not just a man, but a legacy. And she planned to ask the judge for the maximum sentence, because mercy without accountability isn't mercy. It's surrender. As the sentencing date approached, both defendants were offered plea deals. The DA's office, perhaps hedging against the unpredictability of a trial or the possibility of an appeal, offered to drop the open murder charge to second-degree murder in exchange for guilty pleas. Second-degree murder in Nevada carries a sentence of 10 years to life. The deal meant they'd avoid the possibility of first-degree murder convictions, which could carry life without parole. But it also meant admitting guilt. Ayala's attorney recommended he take it. "You're not going to win this," he told him bluntly. "The video is too damning. Take the deal, show some remorse at sentencing, and maybe you'll get parole in your 30s instead of your 60s. Ayala, after days of deliberation, agreed. Keyes took the deal almost immediately, hoping that cooperation and his slightly lesser role might earn leniency. Both pled guilty to second-degree murder, grand theft auto, and leaving the scene of a fatal crash. The plea hearing was brief, procedural. When the judge asked each of them, "Do you understand that by entering this plea you are admitting you intentionally caused the death of Andreas Probst?" They both answered yes, quietly, almost inaudibly. But it was on the record, confession at last. The guilty pleas meant there would be no trial, but the sentencing hearing would serve the same emotional purpose. This was where the public, the family, and the defendants would all face the consequences together. Judge Jones set the sentencing date for November 15th, giving both sides time to submit final arguments, character letters, and sentencing memoranda. The prosecution submitted letters from Andy's colleagues, fellow officers who described him as a mentor and a moral compass. They submitted letters from cycling advocates, from community members, from strangers who'd been moved by his story. And the defense submitted letters, too, from teachers who remembered Ayala as a struggling kid, from Keyes' mother who begged for mercy, from social workers who argued that incarceration wouldn't heal the trauma that led to the crime. It was a battle of narratives. One side painted the defendants as damaged children who needed help. The other painted them as calculating predators who needed to be removed from society. Both narratives had truth in them, but only one would guide the judge's hand when she decided how many years of their lives to take. November the 15th arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that feels like the sky itself is holding its breath. By 7 a.m., a line had already formed outside the Clark County Courthouse. Reporters with cameras and notebooks, victim advocates in matching jackets, retired officers wearing pins with Andy's photo, protesters on both sides, some holding signs demanding justice, others calling for mercy and reform. Security was doubled. Metal detectors ran continuously. Everyone knew this wasn't just a sentencing, it was a referendum. On youth, on violence, on whether society still believed in consequences or had surrendered to the idea that cruelty could be excused if the person inflicting it was young enough. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. The gallery was standing room only. The Probst family sat in their usual row, dressed in somber colors, Andy's photo once again in Crystal's hands. Across the aisle, Ayala's mother sat alone, eyes red and swollen. Key's mother was there too, clutching a rosary, whispering prayers under her breath. At 9 a.m. sharp, the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Jones entered, black robe flowing, and the weight of what was about to happen settled over everyone like a shroud. Ayala and Keys were brought in separately, each flanked by deputies. They wore dress shirts and slacks instead of jumpsuits, an attempt by their attorneys to make them look less like criminals and more like the children they technically still were. Ayala walked with his head up, but the bravado was gone. His face was blank, guarded, like he was bracing for impact. Keys looked smaller somehow, hunched and pale, eyes darting nervously around the room. They sat at their respective tables, not looking at each other, not looking at the family. Judge Jones reviewed the case file for a moment, then looked up. This is a sentencing hearing for Jesus Ayala and Jasimir Keys, both of whom have pled guilty to second-degree murder, grand theft auto, and leaving the scene of a fatal accident. Before I impose sentence, I will hear from the victim's family, the prosecution, the defense, and the defendants themselves. We'll begin with the victim impact statements. She nodded toward the prosecutor. Our Elena Vargas stood and called Taylor Probst to the podium. Taylor walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, hands trembling slightly as she unfolded a piece of paper. She didn't look at Ayala or Keys. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but tight. "My father was the best man I've ever known. He wasn't perfect, but he was good. He believed in fairness. He believed in giving people a chance to do the right thing. He spent 30 years running toward danger so that strangers could be safe. And on August 14th, he was killed by two people who treated his life like it was worth nothing." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "I've been a cop for 8 years. I've seen horrible things, but nothing prepared me for sitting in this courtroom and hearing my father's last moments, hearing the laughter, hearing them celebrate as he died." She paused, swallowing hard. "They didn't just take his life, they took his future. He'll never meet his grandchildren. He'll never walk me down the aisle. He'll never retire to the things he loved, riding, reading, being with my mom. They stole all of that, for a video, for a joke." She finally looked at the defendants. "I don't know if you understand what you did. I don't know if you care. But I hope you spend every day for the rest of your lives thinking about the man you killed. Because we do, and every single day." Taylor stepped down, and Crystal Probst took her place. She was smaller, older, her grief etched into every line of her face. She gripped the podium with both hands and spoke quietly, forcing the room to lean in to hear her. "I was married to Andy for 41 years, she said. 41 years of waking up next to him, of building a life together, of believing we'd grow old together. And then one morning he kissed me goodbye and rode his bike, and I never saw him alive again." Her voice broke and she stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. The courtroom was silent. After a moment, she continued. "I don't understand how two people could laugh at another person dying. I don't understand how anyone could do that. But I know this, my husband believed in accountability. He believed that actions have consequences. And I'm asking you, Your Honor, to give these boys the maximum sentence the law allows, not because I hate them, but because justice requires it. Because if we don't hold people accountable for taking a life, then what are we? She looked directly at Ayala and Keyes. You took everything from me. I hope you understand that. She turned and walked back to her seat, collapsing into her daughter's arms. Two more family members spoke. Andy's brother, a retired firefighter, and a close friend from his police academy days. Each painted a picture of a man whose life had meaning, whose absence created a void that would never be filled. By the time they finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the gallery. Judge Jones thanked them, her own voice slightly hoarse, and turned to the defense. Counsel, do your clients wish to make a statement before sentencing? Ayala's attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Ayala would like to address the court. Ayala rose slowly, his lawyer handing him a piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment, then began reading in a flat, monotone voice. I want to say I'm sorry for what happened. I didn't mean for anyone to die. I was stupid and made a bad choice. I think about it every day. I know I can't take it back, but I wish I could. I'm sorry to the family. He sat down. No eye contact, no emotion. Just words on a page, delivered like a book report. The judge's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or disgust. Keyes' turn was different. He stood without notes, his hands shaking. And he looked toward the Probst family, tears already streaming down his face. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking immediately. I'm so sorry. I think about Mr. Probst every day. I see his face. I hear what happened. And I know it's my fault, too. I should have stopped it. I should have said something. I didn't, and I'll never forgive myself for that. He sobbed openly now, barely able to get the words out. I was trying to impress someone. I was trying to be cool. And because of that, a good man is dead. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect his family to forgive me. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. He sat down, burying his face in his hands. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. The courtroom was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Some people seemed moved by Keyes' emotion. Others seemed skeptical, wondering if it was genuine or performative. Taylor Probst stared at him, her face unreadable. Her Crystal didn't look at all. Judge Jones let the silence sit for a moment, then spoke. I want to address both defendants directly. She looked at Ayala first. Mr. Ayala, I've presided over many cases in my career. I've seen remorse, real remorse. What you just gave me was not that. You read words off a page that someone probably wrote for you, and you didn't mean a single one of them. You have shown, from the moment you were arrested to this very moment, a complete lack of empathy. You bragged about this crime. You joked about it. You thought your age would protect you. It won't. She turned to Keyes. Mr. Keyes, I believe your tears are real. I believe you feel bad. But I don't believe you feel bad for Mr. Probst. I believe you feel bad for yourself because you got caught, because your life is over. You had a chance to stop this. You had a chance to say no, to put the phone down, to tell your friend he was being insane. You didn't. You encouraged it. You filmed it. You laughed. And now a man is dead. She opened the sentencing file in front of her, taking her time. The room seemed to shrink. This case has forced me to think deeply about justice, about mercy, and about what we owe to victims and to society. I've read the psychological evaluations. I've reviewed the brain science. I understand that you are young. I understand that your brains are still developing. But I also understand that millions of teenagers face hardship, trauma, and peer pressure. And they do not commit murder. You made a choice, and that choice was not made in a split second. It was made over the course of minutes. You saw Mr. Probst. You talked about hitting him. You accelerated toward him, and when you succeeded, you celebrated. That is not immaturity, that is depravity." She paused, looking at both of them. "The law gives me discretion in sentencing. I could give you the minimum, 10 years to life. I could give you something in the middle, or I could give you the maximum. I've decided on the latter." The room erupted in whispers. Judge Jones raised a hand for silence. "Jesus Ayala, you're hereby sentenced to 20 years to life in the Nevada Department of Corrections for the murder of Andreas Probst. You will serve an additional 1 to 4 years for grand theft auto and 1 to 4 years for leaving the scene to run consecutively. You will not be eligible for parole for a minimum of 23 years. And by the time you're eligible, you will be 40 years old. Whether you are ever released will depend entirely on whether you can demonstrate genuine rehabilitation and remorse, which, based on your behavior in this courtroom, I have serious doubts about." Ayala stared at the table. His mother let out a choked sob. Judge Jones continued, "Jameer Keys, you are sentenced to 18 years to life for second-degree murder, with additional consecutive sentences for the related charges, and you will not be eligible for parole for a minimum of 21 years. You will be nearly 40 years old before you have a chance at freedom. I am giving you a slightly lesser sentence because I do believe you were a follower. But make no mistake, you are just as responsible for Mr. Probst's death as the driver." Judge Jones closed the file and leaned forward. "I want to be very clear about something. You thought recording this crime made you powerful. You thought it made you untouchable. Or instead, it became the witness that never forgot, never lied, and never stopped testifying against you. You handed us your own conviction, and now you will spend the best years of your lives in a cell where the only audience you'll have is yourself." She picked up her gavel. "This court is adjourned." The gavel fell. The sound echoed. Final. Irrevocable. Ayala sat frozen. Keys collapsed forward, sobbing into his arms. Deputies moved in immediately, she lifting both boys to their feet and guiding them toward the side door that led back to lockup. As they were led away, Ayala glanced back one last time. His eyes found the Probst family. Crystal stared back, her face hard, holding Andy's photo like a shield. Ayala looked away, and then he was gone, swallowed by the system he thought would never touch him. The courtroom cleared slowly. Some people stood immediately, gathering their things, rushing toward the hallway to file reports or give statements. Others sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. The Probst family remained in their seats for several minutes, holding each other, letting the weight of the moment settle. 20 years to life. 18 years to life. Numbers that sounded large but felt small when measured against the permanence of loss. Andy wasn't coming back. No sentence could change that. But there was something in the finality of the gavel, and in the judge's unwavering tone that offered a sliver of closure. The system had listened, the system had seen, and the system had responded. Taylor was the first to stand. She helped her mother to her feet, keeping an arm around her as they moved toward the aisle. Crystal still clutched Andy's photo, her thumb tracing the edge of the frame like a prayer. A victim advocate met them at the door, guiding them toward a private room where they could compose themselves before facing the wall of cameras waiting outside. Behind them, Ayala's mother sat alone, weeping into her hands, abandoned by the gallery. No one approached her. No one offered comfort. She was the mother of a murderer, and in the court of public opinion, that made her guilty too. Outside, the scene was chaos. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes aimed at the sky. Reporters jostled for position on the courthouse steps, microphones extended, cameras rolling. Protesters on both sides had grown louder during the hearing, their chants now blending into an incomprehensible roar. "Justice for Andy," on one side, "Kids deserve mercy," on the other. Police formed a barrier between the groups, hands resting on belts, eyes scanning for trouble. When the Probst family emerged, the crowd quieted slightly, a collective held breath. Taylor stepped up to a cluster of microphones, her mother beside her, and delivered a statement that was equal parts gratitude and grief. Today, the justice system did what it was supposed to do. It held two people accountable for taking a life. We are grateful to Judge Jones, to the prosecutors, to everyone who worked to bring us to this moment. But we want to be clear. This doesn't bring my father back. It doesn't erase our pain. It just ensures that the people who killed him can't hurt anyone else for a very long time. And maybe, just maybe, they'll spend that time learning what remorse actually looks like. The media coverage was instant and overwhelming. Within an hour, every major news outlet had posted the sentencing details. The headlines ranged from factual, "Teens get 20 years to life for killing retired police chief," to sensational, "Smirking teen murderers finally face justice." Cable news pundits debated the sentence. Some praised Judge Jones for her strength and moral clarity. Others criticized the sentences as too harsh, arguing that the justice system had failed by treating children like adults. Legal analysts broke down the parole process, are explaining that 20 years to life didn't mean automatic release after 20 years. It meant eligibility. Both Ayala and Keyes would have to go before a parole board, demonstrate rehabilitation, show remorse, convince a panel of skeptics that they were no longer a danger to society. Given the video, given their behavior in court, most experts agreed they'd serve far longer than the minimum. Some speculated they'd die in prison. On social media, the reaction was predictably divided. Thousands of comments celebrated the sentences. Finally, justice. Hope they rot. Should have been life without parole. But there were also voices of dissent, particularly from juvenile justice advocates, who argued that no teenager should be sentenced to decades in prison, no matter the crime. The debate raged for days. Behind the scenes, the reality of what came next began to settle over Ayala and Keyes. They were transferred from juvenile detention to the Nevada Department of Corrections intake facility, where they were processed like any other adult offenders. Fingerprints, mugshots, medical exams, psychological screenings. They were issued prison uniforms, assigned identification numbers, and told the rules. No phones, no social media, no internet. The world they'd lived in, the world of likes and shares and viral clips, was gone. In its place was a world of cells and counts and concrete. Ayala was sent to a medium security facility in the northern part of the state, placed in a unit with other young offenders serving long sentences. Keyes went to a different facility, segregated for his own safety given his age and the high-profile nature of his crime. Both would spend the next several years in educational programs, mandatory counseling, and the grinding monotony of prison routine. The question that haunted everyone who followed the case was simple. Would they change? And would 20 years be enough time to turn two boys who laughed at death into men who understood the weight of what they'd done? For the Probst family, the sentencing marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The legal battle was over. There would be no appeals to worry about, no retrials, no parole hearings for at least 2 decades. But the emotional battle was just beginning. Crystal started therapy, something Andy had always encouraged, but she'd never felt she needed. Now she needed it. The nights were the hardest. The house felt too big, too quiet. She'd wake up reaching for him, forgetting for a half second that he was gone, and then the reality would crash over her again. Taylor threw herself into work, taking on extra cases, volunteering with victim advocacy groups, anything to keep moving. She started speaking at high schools, talking to kids about the real consequences of reckless behavior. She'd show Andy's photo, tell his story, and then ask the room a single question. Was a viral video worth this? Most kids said no. A few looked uncomfortable, one or two smirked. Those were the ones that scared her. Those were the ones who reminded her that Ayala and Keyes weren't anomalies. They were symptoms. The video, despite the family's wishes, continued to circulate. Redacted versions appeared on true crime YouTube channels, dissected frame by amateur detectives and armchair psychologists. And some creators monetized the content, using Andy's death to generate ad revenue. The family considered legal action, but ultimately decided against it. Fighting the internet was like fighting the tide. Better to focus their energy on something productive. Crystal and Taylor started a foundation in Andy's name, dedicated to advocating for cyclist safety, supporting families of hit-and-run victims, and pushing for stricter penalties for drivers who kill vulnerable road users. They lobbied the state legislature for a bill that would mandate harsher sentences for crimes involving intentional vehicular violence. The bill, dubbed Andy's Law, gained traction. Within a year, it passed. It wouldn't bring Andy back, but it might save someone else. That mattered. That had to matter. Months passed. The media moved on to other stories, other tragedies, other viral moments. The Probst case faded from the headlines, becoming just another entry in the long archive of American violence. But for those directly involved, time didn't heal so much as it numbed. Crystal learned to live with the absence. She kept Andy's bike in the garage, couldn't bear to get rid of it, but also couldn't look at it without feeling her throat tighten. She started riding herself, slowly at first, on quiet streets early in the morning. It was her way of staying close to him. Of finishing the rides he couldn't. Taylor got engaged, and the joy was real, but shadowed by the fact that her father wouldn't be there to walk her down the aisle. She asked her uncle to do it instead, and he agreed, though they both knew it wasn't the same. On what would have been Andy's 66th birthday, the family gathered at his grave. They brought flowers, told stories, laughed at old memories. For a few hours, the grief felt lighter, not gone, just lighter. That was all they could ask for. Meanwhile, inside the prison system, Ayala and Keyes began their long sentences. Ayala remained defiant for the first year, getting into fights, racking up disciplinary infractions, spending weeks at a time in solitary confinement. Other inmates knew his case. Some respected him for it, kids who saw violence as currency, who thought killing someone made you hard. Others despised him, especially the older prisoners who had families, who couldn't stomach what he'd done. One inmate, a lifer in his 50s, confronted Ayala in the yard. "You killed a cop for a video?" he said, shaking his head. "You're not tough. You're pathetic." Ayala tried to fight back, but age and experience won. He ended up with a broken nose and a new understanding. Prison wasn't high school. Clout didn't matter here. Survival did. Slowly, over months and then years, the bravado began to crack. Keyes had a different experience. He stayed quiet, kept his head down, attended every counseling session, completed his GED, enrolled in a vocational program. And he wrote letters to the Probst family, though they were returned unopened. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He just needed them to know he was trying. Whether that was genuine or strategic, even he wasn't sure anymore. In interviews years later, Crystal Probst would say that the hardest part wasn't the sentencing or the trial or even the immediate aftermath. It was the realization that life goes on. Birthdays still come. Holidays still happen. The world keeps turning. I'm indifferent to your pain. People stop asking how you're doing. They assume you've moved on. But you haven't. You've just learned to carry it better. Grief doesn't get smaller, she said once in a documentary about the case. You just get bigger around it. You build a life that includes the loss, and you keep going because that's what he would have wanted. It was a truth born from experience, not philosophy. A truth carved out of sleepless nights and empty chairs and the quiet. His stubborn refusal to let the people who killed her husband also kill her spirit. The sentencing had given her justice. But healing? That was something she'd have to do herself. One day at a time, one ride at a time, one memory at a time. And slowly, painfully, she did. The Probst case didn't end when the gavel fell. It echoed. In courtrooms across the country, prosecutors began citing it as precedent when arguing for adult charges in juvenile cases involving social media documentation. Defense attorneys referenced it too, warning about the dangers of letting a single viral video define a defendant's entire character. Judges used it in sentencing remarks, reminding young offenders that the phones in their pockets could become the witnesses that destroyed them. The case became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a cultural touchstone. Law schools analyzed it, criminology classes dissected it. And in living rooms across America, parents sat their teenagers down and asked a simple question. Do you understand that what you post can ruin your life? Some kids listened, others rolled their eyes and went back to scrolling. The gap between those two responses represented the broader divide the case had exposed, a generational chasm between those who saw social media as performance and those who saw it as evidence. One of the most significant conversations the case sparked was about the psychology of virality. Psychologists and sociologists began studying the phenomenon of clout crimes, offenses committed not out of necessity or even traditional thrill-seeking, but specifically to generate online attention. Stealing cars, assaulting strangers, committing acts of violence and filming them for likes, shares, and comments. The Probst case became a reference point in these studies. Researchers noted that Ayala and Keyes didn't just commit a crime, they performed it. The decision to film wasn't incidental. It was central. The video was the point. Without an audience, real or imagined, would they have done it? Some experts argued no, that the presence of the camera fundamentally changed the calculus. Others argued that the camera simply revealed what was already there, a cruelty that would have expressed itself with or without a lens. Either way, the case forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Technology hadn't created evil, but it had amplified it, rewarded it, and made it easier to spread. Parents and educators struggled to respond. Schools started implementing social media literacy programs, teaching kids not just how to use platforms, but how to think critically about the content they consumed and created. Assemblies featured speakers from law enforcement, victim advocates, and even former offenders who'd filmed their own crimes and paid the price. The message was consistent. Your phone is not a toy. It's a tool that can save you or destroy you, depending on how you use it. But the effectiveness of these programs was hard to measure. For every teenager who walked away thinking twice about posting something reckless, there were others who saw the warnings as hype, as adults overreacting to kid stuff. The disconnect was maddening for those trying to prevent the next tragedy. How do you reach a generation that's been raised to document everything, to turn every moment into content, to measure worth in views and validation? And the Probst case offered no easy answers. It just made the questions more urgent. The cycling community, meanwhile, rallied around Andy's memory in tangible ways. Memorial rides became annual events in Las Vegas and beyond. Hundreds of cyclists would gather on the anniversary of his death, riding the same route he'd taken that morning, stopping at the site of the crash to lay flowers and observe a moment of silence. Advocacy groups used his story to push for better infrastructure, protected bike lanes, stricter enforcement of traffic laws, public awareness campaigns reminding drivers that cyclists are people, not obstacles. Some cities responded. Las Vegas installed new signage along Tenaya Way, marking it as a memorial corridor and warning drivers to share the road. Other jurisdictions passed vulnerable road user laws, increasing penalties for drivers who injure or kill pedestrians and cyclists. These changes didn't happen because of the Probst case alone, but it added urgency and a human face to abstract policy debates. Every time a legislator stood up to advocate for cyclist safety, Andy's photo was somewhere in the room. His death had become a catalyst, whether his family wanted that burden or not. Law enforcement agencies across the country also took note. The case became required viewing in some police academies, used to illustrate the importance of digital forensics and the ways social media had changed investigative work. Detectives were trained to think of phones not just as communication devices, but as crime scene archives. They learned to pull metadata, trace digital footprints, recover deleted files. The Probst case was a textbook example of how a suspect's own documentation could become the strongest evidence against them. But it also raised ethical questions. Should police be monitoring teenagers' social media proactively, looking for warning signs of potential violence? Civil liberties groups said no, arguing that it was a step toward surveillance and profiling. Victim advocacy groups said yes, arguing that if monitoring could prevent another Andy Probst, it was worth the intrusion. The debate was heated and unresolved, another thread in the larger conversation about privacy, safety, and the cost of both. The criminal justice reform community was similarly divided. For years, advocates had been pushing to end the practice of charging juveniles as adults, citing research on brain development and the success of rehabilitation programs in other countries. The Probst case complicated that narrative. Reformers found themselves in the uncomfortable position of defending a system that would have given Ayala and Keyes lighter sentences, potentially releasing them back into society in their 20s. And how do you argue for leniency when the crime is this brutal, this callous, this documented? Some advocates doubled down, insisting that the principles of juvenile justice shouldn't be abandoned just because a case is emotionally difficult. Others quietly admitted that cases like this, where intent is clear, remorse is absent, and the crime is celebrated, might require exceptions. The conversation fractured along ideological lines, with purists on one side and pragmatists on the other, and no clear resolution in sight. What everyone agreed on, though, was that the current system, charging some juveniles as adults while treating others as children, often based on factors like race, geography, and media attention, was inconsistent and unjust. The Probst case didn't solve that problem. It just made it impossible to ignore. Media ethicists, meanwhile, grappled with their own complicity. The video had been everywhere, dissected on YouTube, discussed on podcasts, screenshotted on Twitter. True crime creators built entire channels around cases like this, monetizing tragedy, turning grief into content. Some argued it was journalism, that exposing the reality of violence served a public good. Others argued it was exploitation, that replaying a man's death over and over for ad revenue was no different than what Ayala and Keyes had done, turning human suffering into entertainment. The line between education and voyeurism was thin and constantly shifting. Some creators tried to walk it carefully, blurring faces, muting audio, contextualizing the horror. Others didn't bother. The Probst family had asked repeatedly for the video not to be shared. But once something is online, asking for it to be removed is like asking the ocean to give back a drop of water. It doesn't work. The best they could do was refuse to watch, refuse to engage, and hope that somewhere someone would see the video and choose differently than Ayala and Keyes had. That maybe Andy's death, horrific as it was, might save someone else. Years after the sentencing, a journalist reached out to Crystal Probst for an interview. She hesitated. She'd mostly stopped talking to the press, exhausted by the cycle of retelling, reliving, reopening wounds. But this journalist was working on a long-form piece about the societal impact of the case, and Crystal thought maybe, just maybe, there was value in speaking one more time. They met at a quiet coffee shop far from the courthouse, far from the crash site, far from the places that carried too much weight. The journalist asked her what she wanted people to remember about Andy. Not about his death, about his life. Crystal thought for a long time before answering. "I want people to know he was kind," she said finally. "That he believed in people, that he spent his whole career giving second chances to kids who messed up. It's because he thought everyone deserved a chance to do better. And I want people to understand that the boys who killed him weren't given a death sentence. They were given time. Time to grow up. Time to change. Time to become something other than what they were that day." Andy would have wanted that, not because they deserve it, but because that's who he was. The journalist wrote it down, and when the piece was published, that quote became the closing line. It didn't go viral. It didn't trend. But it was true. And in a story saturated with spectacle, truth felt like the rarest thing of all. The first 5 years were the hardest. Not for the victims, grief doesn't operate on a timeline, but for Ayala and Keyes, who discovered that prison wasn't the temporary inconvenience they'd imagined. It was a new reality, brutal and unforgiving, where every day looked the same, and time moved both too slowly and too fast. Ayala housed at Northern Nevada Correctional Center. I'd spent the early months in survival mode. He was young, relatively small, and infamous. Other inmates had seen the video or heard about the case. Some respected the violence. Most didn't. Older convicts, especially those who'd committed crimes in moments of desperation or passion, looked at him with contempt. "You killed someone for fun," their eyes said. "You're not one of us. You're something worse." He got into fights, spent months in administrative segregation, just cycled through anger and denial, and a creeping, unwelcome realization that nobody was coming to save him. His mother visited twice in the first year, then stopped. His friends on the outside moved on. The attention he'd craved disappeared. He was alone with what he'd done. Keyes had a slightly different trajectory. Placed at a facility with a stronger rehabilitative focus, he was surrounded by counselors, educators, and programs designed to reshape young offenders. At first, he participated because it was expected. Attendance at group therapy, anger management, victim empathy workshops. It was all part of playing the game, checking boxes that might look good in a future parole hearing. But somewhere around year 3, something shifted. He started reading. Not because anyone forced him, but because books offered an escape from the monotony and the guilt. He read memoirs of people who'd survived trauma. He read philosophy, struggling through dense passages about morality and consequence. He read letters written by victims' families in other cases, trying to understand the weight of what he'd taken. In therapy, he stopped reciting the lines he thought people wanted to hear and started admitting the things that scared him. That he liked the attention the video brought. That he'd felt powerful in that moment. That he didn't think of Andy as a real person, just an object in the frame. Saying those things out loud, but in a room full of other offenders and a therapist who'd heard it all, was harder than anything he'd done before. By year 7, the differences between Ayala and Keyes had become stark. Ayala had plateaued. He stayed out of major trouble, worked a prison job in the kitchen, kept to himself. But in mandated counseling sessions, he remained guarded, giving surface-level answers, unwilling or unable to access genuine remorse. Psychologists noted that he intellectually understood he'd done something wrong. He could articulate that murder is bad, that Andy's family suffered. But there was a disconnect between knowing and feeling. When asked how he'd feel if someone killed his mother the way he killed Andy, he shrugged. "I'd be mad, I guess." No tears, no visceral reaction, just words. His counselors wrote in their reports that Ayala demonstrated limited emotional growth and posed a continued risk if released. Keyes, by contrast, was thriving relative to the circumstances. He earned his GED, then started taking college courses through a prison education program. He became a peer mentor, helping newer inmates adjust. He wrote letters, not to the Probst family, who'd made clear they wanted no contact, but to himself, journaling his thoughts, trying to trace the path that led him to that car on that morning. He wrote about his childhood, the neglect, the need to be seen. But he also wrote about the choice, and the moment he could have said no and didn't. "I can't blame everything on where I came from," he wrote in one entry. "At some point, it was just me, and I chose wrong." The prison system, for all its flaws, does offer opportunities for change, but only to those willing to take them. Ayala wasn't, or couldn't. His psychological evaluations suggested a personality structure resistant to introspection. He saw himself as a victim of circumstance, bad luck, a system that overreacted. He talked about the video as if it were a separate thing, disconnected from his actions. "It wasn't supposed to blow up like that," he told a counselor once. Not, "I wasn't supposed to kill someone," but the video wasn't supposed to go viral. The distinction was chilling. Keyes, on the other hand, seemed to grasp, slowly and painfully, that he'd destroyed more than just Andy's life. He'd destroyed his own family, his own future, his own sense of self. In group therapy, he spoke about carrying Andy's face with him everywhere. "I see him when I close my eyes," he said. "I hear the sound. I can't make it stop, and I don't think I should, because forgetting would be worse." Whether that was genuine remorse or well-rehearsed performance was a question even he couldn't fully answer. But it was more than Ayala ever offered. As the years piled up, both men aged out of the category of troubled teen and into adult offender. Their 20s passed in gray uniforms and concrete yards. They missed proms, graduations, first jobs, first loves. They missed the formative experiences that turn kids into adults. Instead, they became products of the system, institutionalized, their identities shaped by counts and cells and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Ayala grew bitter. He wrote angry letters to advocacy groups, claiming his sentence was unjust, that he was being punished for a mistake, that society had given up on him. Some groups wrote back, sympathetic to the broader cause of juvenile justice reform, even if his specific case made them uneasy. Others ignored him. Keyes, meanwhile, focused inward. He stopped asking for sympathy and started asking for purpose. He volunteered for restorative justice programs, sitting in circles with other offenders, talking about harm and accountability. And he didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted to be useful, to make something of the years he had left before parole eligibility became a possibility. The question of redemption loomed large, not just for them, but for everyone watching. Can someone who laughs at death ever truly change? Is remorse something you feel or something you perform well enough to convince others? And who gets to decide? The parole board, 2 decades from now, will face that question. They'll review files, watch recorded statements, interview psychologists and correctional officers. They'll see 2 men in their late 30s or early 40s, far removed from the teenagers in the video. But they'll also see the video itself, which will never age, never change, never stop being evidence of who they were. And the question will be, is who you were enough to define who you are forever? For some crimes, society says yes. For others, it's less clear. The Probst case lived in that murky middle, where the brutality demanded a harsh response, but the age of the offenders complicated it. There were no easy answers, just decades of waiting to see if time could turn monsters back into men. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the world moved on. Technology advanced. Social media evolved. TikTok became the dominant platform, replacing Instagram and Snapchat in teen culture. New viral challenges emerged, some harmless, some dangerous, a few deadly. The cycle repeated. so kids filmed themselves doing reckless things. Some got hurt, some hurt others. And each time, the Probst case would be cited in news articles and think pieces, a grim reminder that the quest for virality could have fatal consequences. But memory is short, and attention spans shorter. The warnings faded into background noise. New tragedies took center stage. The Probst case became history, a cautionary tale relegated to documentaries and true crime podcasts. Consumed by audiences who shook their heads and said, "I would never," before scrolling to the next video. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Andy's death was supposed to be a turning point. Instead, it became content, just like Ayala and Keyes intended. Except this time, the world was the audience, and the lesson was lost in the noise. Inside, Ayala and Keyes continued their separate paths. Ayala grew harder, more resigned, more convinced that the world had written him off. Keyes grew quieter, more contemplative, more haunted by the thing he couldn't undo. Neither would be eligible for parole until their 40s. By then, the world would be unrecognizable from the one they left. The internet would have evolved. The culture would have shifted. And two middle-aged men would stand before a parole board, trying to explain why a decision they made as teenagers shouldn't define the rest of their lives. Whether they'd succeed was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain: Andy Probst would still be dead. His family would still carry the loss, and no amount of remorse, real or performed, would ever change that. Justice had been served in the form of decades behind bars. But closure? That was something else entirely. Something that couldn't be sentenced or paroled. Something the Probst family would have to find on their own, one painful day at a time. 10 years after Andy's death, Crystal Probst stood in the Nevada state legislature and watching as Governor Lombardo signed Andy's law into permanent statute. The bill had taken years of lobbying, testimonies, revisions, and compromises. It wasn't everything the family had hoped for, but it was something. The law created mandatory minimum sentences for drivers who intentionally use vehicles as weapons, closed loopholes that had allowed some offenders to plead down to lesser charges, and established a victim notification system so families would be informed of parole hearings and sentence reductions. It also dedicated funding for cyclist safety infrastructure across the state, protected bike lanes, better signage, public awareness campaigns. Andy's name was etched into the legislative record, ensuring that his death would mean something beyond grief. Crystal watched the governor's pen move across the paper, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to pride. Not happiness. She wasn't sure she'd ever feel that fully again, but pride that Andy's life and his death had created change. The foundation Crystal and Taylor had started in Andy's name had grown beyond their expectations. What began as a small fund to support hit-and-run victim families had evolved into a national organization advocating for vulnerable road users, funding scholarships for children who'd lost parents to traffic violence, and providing legal assistance to families navigating the criminal justice system. They held annual fundraisers, partnered with cycling advocacy groups, and worked with law enforcement to train officers on the unique trauma of vehicular homicide cases. Taylor, who'd taken a leave of absence from her detective work to run the foundation full-time, found purpose in the mission. She couldn't save her father, but she could honor him by helping others. Every family they assisted, on every scholarship they awarded, every piece of legislation they influenced, it was a way of keeping Andy alive, not in body, but in impact. He always said that one person can make a difference, Taylor told a room of donors once. He proved it his whole career, and now we're proving it in his name. The foundation also took on the complicated task of addressing youth violence and social media culture, and they partnered with schools to implement programs that didn't just warn kids about the dangers of filming crimes, but taught them empathy, critical thinking, and the long-term consequences of their digital footprints. The curriculum included case studies, not just the Probst case, though it was referenced, but a range of examples showing how viral moments could ruin lives on both sides of the camera. Some students engaged genuinely, asking thoughtful questions about accountability and redemption. Others tuned out, convinced it wouldn't happen to them. The Foundation's educators learned to accept that they wouldn't reach everyone. But if they reached even a handful, if they prevented even one future tragedy, it was worth it. "We're not trying to scare kids," Taylor explained in an interview. "We're trying to wake them up, to remind them that the people on the other side of the screen are real, that actions have weight, that you can't undo a video once it's out there, and you can't undo the harm it causes." Andy's legacy also lived on in the law enforcement community. His name came up frequently at police academies, in training seminars, in eulogies for other officers killed in the line of duty or after retirement. He became a symbol of service without ego, of quiet competence, of the kind of officer communities need, but don't always appreciate until they're gone. A scholarship was established in his name at the California Police Academy, and awarded annually to a cadet who demonstrated leadership, integrity, and a commitment to community policing. Recipients of the scholarship were required to write an essay about what accountability meant to them, and every year Andy's family read those essays, looking for echoes of the values he'd lived by. Some were formulaic, box-checking exercises, but others were raw and honest, written by young people who understood that wearing a badge meant carrying the weight of public trust. And those essays reminded Crystal why the work mattered, why Andy's life mattered, why even in death he was still teaching. Cycling communities across the country continued to honor Andy in their own ways. Ghost bikes, white-painted bicycles placed at crash sites as memorials, appeared wherever cyclists were killed by drivers. Some bore Andy's name, even in cities far from Las Vegas, as a gesture of solidarity. Advocacy groups invoked his story when lobbying for safer infrastructure, reminding city councils and transportation departments that every statistic represented a person, a family, a hole that would never be filled. Some jurisdictions listened. Protected bike lanes expanded. Vision Zero initiatives gained funding. Penalties for distracted and reckless driving increased. Other places dragged their feet, prioritizing car traffic over vulnerable users, viewing cyclists as inconveniences rather than citizens. The fight was ongoing, exhausting, incremental. But Andy's name carried weight in those rooms. It reminded decision-makers that inaction had consequences, that doing nothing meant more deaths, more families shattered, more ghosts on the side of the road. The media, too, continued to reference the case, though often in ways that frustrated the Probst family. True crime documentaries featured it prominently, usually in episodes about youth violence or social media crimes. Some were respectful, centering Andy's story, interviewing the family, and exploring the broader societal issues. Others were sensationalized, focused more on the killers than the victim, using clickbait titles and dramatic reenactments. Crystal stopped watching after the first few. It was too painful to see Andy reduced to a plot point, his death repackaged as entertainment for an audience that would forget him as soon as the next episode autoplayed. But she understood that she couldn't control the narrative. Once the story was public, it belonged to everyone. All she could do was continue telling her version, the one where Andy was more than a victim, where his life mattered as much as his death, where justice wasn't just about punishment, but about preventing the next tragedy. As the 10-year anniversary approached, the family planned a memorial event at the site of the crash. The city had agreed to install a permanent plaque marking the spot where Andy was killed and honoring his life of service. Hundreds of people, RSVP'd, fellow officers, cyclists, victim advocates, community members who'd never met Andy but felt connected to his story. The day was bright and clear, the kind of morning Andy would have loved for a ride. Crystal stood beside the plaque, running her fingers over the engraved letters of his name, and felt the weight of a decade. 10 years since she'd kissed him goodbye. 10 years of learning to live in a world without him. 10 years of grief and advocacy, and small victories that never quite felt like enough. Taylor stood beside her, placing a bouquet of flowers at the base of the plaque. "He'd be proud of what we've built," she said quietly. Crystal nodded. "I hope so. I hope he knows." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by a sea of people who'd come to remember a man they'd never met, but whose death had touched them. And in that silence, there was something close to peace. Later that evening, at a reception hosted by the foundation, Crystal was approached by a young woman she didn't recognize. The woman introduced herself nervously, explaining that she'd been in high school when Andy was killed. She'd been friends with kids who thought the video was funny, who shared it in group chats, who joked about it. She'd gone along with it, not thinking much about it, until her school brought in a speaker, a victim advocate who told Andy's story. "I don't know why, but something clicked," the woman said, tears in her eyes. "I realized I was laughing at someone's dad, someone's husband. I stopped sharing that kind of stuff. I started calling out my friends when they did, and I'm studying social work now because I want to help prevent kids from becoming like the ones who killed your husband." Crystal hugged her, holding on longer than she'd intended. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me that." It was a small moment, one conversation in a sea of thousands, but it mattered. It proved that change was possible, that even in the darkest stories, light could find a way in, that Andy's death, as senseless and cruel as it was, had planted seeds that were still growing. As the years continued to pass, the Probst family knew they'd eventually face another painful milestone, the parole hearings for Ayala and Keyes. Those wouldn't happen for another decade, but the thought of them loomed. The idea of sitting in another courtroom, listening to the men who killed Andy argue for their freedom, was almost unbearable. But Crystal and Taylor had already decided they'd be there. They'd deliver impact statements again, reminding the parole board of what was taken, of who Andy was, of why releasing these men, if they were released, required absolute certainty that they'd changed. They'd bring the photo, they'd bring the letters, they'd bring the weight of 10, 20, 30 years of absence. And they'd let the board decide, because that was how the system worked. Imperfectly, painfully. But it was the system Andy had believed in, and honoring him meant trusting it, even when trust felt impossible. Until then, they'd keep building, keep advocating, keep turning grief into purpose, because that was the only way forward. And Andy, wherever he was, would have wanted them to keep moving. Forgiveness is a word that gets thrown around easily in the aftermath of tragedy. Well-meaning strangers, faith leaders, even therapists sometimes suggest it as a destination, a final stage of grief where pain transforms into peace. But for the Probst family, forgiveness felt less like a goal and more like a trap. People would ask Crystal in interviews or at speaking events whether she'd forgiven Ayala and Keyes. The question always landed wrong, as if forgiveness were something she owed them, or owed herself, or owed some abstract moral universe that demanded closure. Her answer evolved over the years, but the core remained the same. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give," she'd say. "I can't forgive someone for what they did to Andy. That was between them and him, and he's not here to speak for himself. What I can do is choose not to let hatred consume me. That's not the same thing." The distinction mattered to her. She wasn't obligated to absolve them. She was obligated only to herself, to survive, to find meaning in the wreckage. And she had. Taylor struggled with the concept differently. And as a law enforcement officer, she believed in accountability and consequences. She'd seen too many cases where offenders expressed shallow remorse, served minimal time, and reoffended. She'd also seen people genuinely change, transform themselves after hitting rock bottom, and go on to contribute positively to society. The tension between those realities made forgiveness feel impossible to categorize. Some days she felt a flicker of something close to empathy for Keyes. He'd been 16, easily influenced, raised in chaos. Other days she'd remember the laughter on the video and the empathy would evaporate, replaced by cold anger. Ayala, though, was easier to hate. His continued defiance, his lack of growth, his inability to access genuine remorse, it made him a symbol of everything she fought against in her work. She didn't want to forgive him. She didn't think he deserved it. And she'd made peace with that. Forgiveness, she decided, wasn't a requirement for healing. Sometimes, a justice was enough. The broader community had its own complicated relationship with the idea of redemption. Online, debates raged whenever the case resurfaced. Should teenagers ever be sentenced to life-equivalent terms? Can someone who commits a depraved act at 17 be a completely different person at 40? Some argued that the brain science was clear. Adolescents are not fully formed. Their capacity for change is enormous. And writing them off permanently was both cruel and counterproductive. Others argued that intent matters more than age, that laughing at a man's death reveals a moral void that no amount of therapy can fill. Both sides had compelling points. Both sides also had blind spots. The truth, uncomfortable and unsatisfying, was that there was no universal answer. Some people change, some don't. And predicting which category someone falls into, especially decades in advance, is nearly impossible. The criminal justice system tries anyway, using parole boards and risk assessments and psychological evaluations. But it's an imperfect science, and the stakes are life and death. As the years passed, the Probst family found themselves less interested in whether Ayala and Keyes deserved forgiveness and more focused on what they themselves needed to move forward. Therapy helped. So did the foundation, the advocacy work, the sense that Andy's death had created ripples of positive change. But the deepest healing came from smaller, quieter moments. Crystal started painting, something she'd never done before. She painted landscapes mostly, desert scenes, mountains, open roads. She painted Andy on his bike, a small figure against a vast sky, free and untouchable. The paintings weren't technically skilled, but they were honest. They were her way of processing what couldn't be said in words. Taylor, meanwhile, found solace in mentorship. She worked with young officers, teaching them de-escalation techniques, community engagement strategies, the importance of seeing people as people rather than problems. She told them about Andy often, not the way he died, but the way he lived, the patience, the integrity, the belief that most people, given a chance, would choose to do the right thing. She wanted his philosophy to outlive him. The family also had to navigate the strange, uncomfortable reality that the men who killed Andy were aging, changing, so becoming different versions of themselves. Every year they received updates from the Department of Corrections, brief summaries of behavior, program participation, disciplinary records. Keyes' reports showed steady progress. He was working toward an associate degree. He'd completed anger management, victim impact courses, restorative justice training. He'd been disciplinary-free for over 5 years. He wrote letters, not to the family, but to a prison counselor, documenting his journey toward understanding what he'd done. The counselor occasionally shared excerpts with the family, with their permission. "I used to think I was just along for the ride," one excerpt read. "But I was driving too, just with a camera instead of a wheel. And that makes me just as guilty. I have to live with that." Taylor read the letter and felt nothing. Or maybe she felt too much and shut it down. She couldn't afford to humanize him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Ayala's reports painted a different picture. He'd stabilized, stopped getting into fights, but he remained emotionally flat in therapy. He completed programs because they were required, not because he engaged. His letters, when he wrote them, were focused on his own suffering, How hard prison was, how unfair his sentence felt, how society had abandoned him. There was no mention of Andy, no acknowledgement of the family, no sign that he'd moved beyond seeing himself as the victim. His psychological evaluations noted limited capacity for empathy and low likelihood of meaningful rehabilitation. Reading those words gave Crystal a grim sense of validation. She'd been right about him. He hadn't changed. He'd just learned to fake compliance well enough to avoid solitary. Whether that would be enough to convince a parole board in another decade was an open question. But Crystal already knew how she'd respond if he was released. She'd make sure every person in that hearing room saw the video, heard the laughter, understood exactly who they were setting free. The question of what justice truly means haunted the family in quieter ways. They'd gotten convictions. They'd gotten long sentences. They'd gotten a law passed in Andy's name. By any legal standard, justice had been served. But justice, they learned, doesn't undo harm. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't erase the video or the laughter or the years of grief. Justice is just a framework, a societal agreement that certain actions demand certain responses. It's necessary, but it's not enough. Crystal once described it in an interview as a floor, not a ceiling. Justice was the baseline, the minimum society owed them. But healing, meaning, peace, those had to be built on top of it, brick by a painful brick, over years and decades. And even then, the structure was fragile, vulnerable to collapse on hard days, anniversaries, moments when the absence felt too large to contain. Justice didn't prevent those moments. It just ensured that the people responsible couldn't cause them again. For some, that was enough. For others, it would never be. One afternoon, nearly 12 years after Andy's death, Crystal received a call from a restorative justice coordinator. The woman explained that Keyes had expressed interest in participating in a victim offender dialogue program. If the family was open to it, it would be entirely voluntary, completely on their terms, facilitated by trained mediators. The goal wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation, but accountability. Giving Keyes a chance to hear directly how his actions had affected them, and giving the family a chance to ask questions, express their pain, and be seen in their full humanity rather than as abstract victims in a case file. Crystal listened politely, then said no. She didn't need to hear Keyes apologize. She didn't need to see him cry or grovel or explain. Nothing he could say would change anything. And she refused to give him the absolution he was seeking, whether he realized that's what he wanted or not. Taylor agreed. He made his choice, she said. Now he lives with it. We don't owe him closure. The coordinator understood. The offer remained open if they ever changed their minds. They wouldn't. As they approached the 15-year mark, the family found themselves in a strange liminal space. The immediate grief had softened into something more like a chronic ache, always there, but manageable most days. The anger had cooled into a weary resignation. They'd built a life around the loss, a life that included purpose and meaning and even moments of joy. But Andy's absence was still the backdrop to everything, every holiday, every milestone. Every time Crystal saw an older couple riding bikes together, hand in hand, or the way she and Andy used to. The pain was quieter now, but it was permanent. And maybe that was what justice couldn't address. It couldn't touch the permanence. It couldn't restore what was taken. It could only ensure that the taking had consequences. And in a world where so much violence goes unanswered, where so many families scream into the void and hear nothing back, maybe that was something. Maybe it was enough. Or maybe it just had to be, because there was no alternative. No better answer. Just the slow, stubborn work of surviving one day after another, carrying the weight of a man who deserved better, but got this instead. The notification arrived in the mail on a Tuesday morning, 17 years after Andy's death. Crystal stared at the envelope, recognizing the seal of the Nevada Department of Corrections before she even opened it. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the single sheet of paper. It was a formal notice that Jesimir Keys would be eligible for his first parole hearing in 3 years. The letter outlined the process, the timeline, her rights as a victim's family member to submit a statement, to attend the hearing, to be heard. She read it twice, then set it down on the kitchen table and stared at it like it might disappear. It didn't. The day she'd been dreading for nearly 2 decades was finally taking shape. In 3 years, a panel of strangers would decide whether the boy who filmed her husband's murder had earned his freedom. And there was nothing she could do but wait, prepare, and hope the system remembered what she could never forget. Taylor received the same notice. She read it in her car, parked outside the station after a shift. For a moment, she just sat there, engine off, the paper in her lap, feeling the weight of it settle into her chest. 3 years. It felt like both an eternity and no time at all. She'd known this was coming. The sentencing had made it clear, 18 years to life with parole eligibility after 21. Keys had been 16 when he committed the crime, which meant he'd be 37 at his first hearing. An adult, a man, someone who, statistically speaking, would be far less impulsive, less prone to violence, more capable of understanding consequences than the teenager he'd been. The brain science supported that. The data supported that. But data didn't laugh at a man dying. Keys had. And Taylor wasn't sure that any amount of time could erase what that laughter revealed. She called her mother. They talked for an hour, circling the same questions over and over. What if he gets out? What if the board believes he's changed? What if we have to see him free, living a life while Dad is still in the ground? There were no answers. Just fear and anger and the exhausting task of bracing for impact. Ayala's notice would come 2 years later, given his slightly longer minimum sentence. But the family knew his hearing was on the horizon too, and if Key's case was complicated by signs of growth and remorse, Ayala's was straightforward. His prison record showed compliance, but no transformation. He'd aged, yes, he'd stayed out of major trouble. But the psychological evaluations remained damning. Subject demonstrates persistent emotional detachment and limited capacity for empathy. Risk of reoffense remains moderate to high. Crystal read those words in a victim notification report and felt a cold satisfaction. At least with Ayala, the choice would be clear. He hadn't earned release. He'd simply endured time. Keys, though, was harder. He'd done everything the system asked. He'd taken classes, attended therapy, mentored younger inmates. He'd written letters expressing remorse, participated in restorative justice programs, built a record that, on paper, he'd looked like a model of rehabilitation. But paper didn't show the video. Paper didn't capture the sound of teenage laughter as a man took his last breath. And Crystal intended to make sure the parole board never forgot that. The family began preparing immediately, even though the hearing was years away. They met with victim advocates, lawyers, and other families who'd been through the parole process. They learned how to write effective impact statements, how to present evidence, how to navigate the bureaucracy. They were told that parole boards consider many factors: the nature of the crime, the offender's behavior in prison, their release plan, risk assessments, victim input. But they were also warned that boards could be unpredictable, that some prioritized rehabilitation over retribution, that a well-spoken offender with a clean record could be persuasive. The thought terrified Crystal. She imagined Keys sitting before the board, older now, articulate, maybe even genuinely remorseful. She imagined him talking about his trauma, his growth, his plans for the future. And she imagined the board nodding, sympathetic, seeing a man rather than a murderer. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. If they released him, it wouldn't be because they forgot what he did. It would be in spite of remembering, and that required the family to make the remembering impossible to ignore. They started compiling materials, the video obviously, though Crystal still couldn't bring herself to watch it even after all these years. Transcripts of the original trial, photos of Andy, not just the official police portrait, but candid shots of him laughing, riding his bike, holding his grandchildren. Letters from people whose lives he'd touched, fellow officers, community members, kids he'd mentored. They gathered impact statements from extended family, friends, even strangers who'd been moved by his story. The goal was to humanize Andy, to make him more than a case number, to remind the board that this wasn't an abstract policy question. This was about a man who'd been targeted, killed, and mocked by someone now asking for mercy. Taylor also prepared her own statement, writing and rewriting it dozens of times. She wanted it to be devastating but not hysterical, firm but not vengeful. She wanted the board to feel the weight of what they were being asked to do. "You're not just deciding whether Jameer Keys has changed," she planned to say. "You're deciding whether my father's life mattered, whether cruelty has consequences, whether justice means anything at all." As the months turned into years and the hearing date drew closer, the emotional toll on the family became unbearable. Crystal's anxiety spiked. She had nightmares about Keys being released, seeing him at a grocery store, on a bike path, living freely while Andy remained frozen in time. She knew it was irrational. If he was released, he'd likely be placed far from Las Vegas, with strict parole conditions. But fear doesn't follow logic. Taylor threw herself into work, taking extra shifts, avoiding downtime where her mind could wander. She became snappish, irritable, pulling away from friends who couldn't understand why something 3 years away was affecting her now. "Because it's not 3 years," she tried to explain once. "It's every day for 3 years. Waking up, knowing it's coming. It's already happening. We're already living it." Therapy helped, but only to a point. Some wounds don't heal. They just become part of the landscape you navigate, and the parole hearing was a cliff edge they were walking toward, knowing a fall was possible, but not certain. The criminal justice reform community watched cases like this closely. Advocates pointed to Keys as evidence that rehabilitation works, that young offenders can change, that life sentences for juveniles, even de facto life sentences, are cruel and counterproductive. They highlighted his clean record, his education, his participation in programs. They framed his case as a test of whether society genuinely believed in second chances or just paid lip service to the idea. The Probst family hated that framing. They weren't opposed to rehabilitation in theory. They supported programs that helped people change. But they also believed that some crimes were so depraved, so void of humanity, that the offender forfeited the right to benefit from their own eventual growth. He had a choice, Crystal said in a radio interview a year before the hearing. He could have said no. He could have put the phone down. He could have called the police after. He didn't. He laughed. He shared the video. And now, because he's spent 20 years behaving himself in prison, we're supposed to forget that? I don't think so. Consequences aren't just about who you become. They're about what you did, and what he did was unforgivable. 6 months before the hearing, the family received Keys' parole application packet. It included his personal statement, letters of support from prison staff and counselors, his educational transcripts, and a detailed release plan. He'd secured a job offer at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate. He'd be living in a halfway house, attending mandatory therapy, subject to GPS monitoring. He'd written that he understood the harm he caused, that he carried it every day, that he wanted a chance to contribute positively to society. He acknowledged that he didn't deserve forgiveness, but hoped the board would see that he was no longer the person he'd been at 16. Crystal read it once and felt nothing. Or maybe she felt everything and it had just flattened into numbness. Taylor read it and felt rage. "He talks about himself the whole time," she said. "It's all about his pain, his growth, his future. He mentions my father once, in a paragraph about the victim, like Dad doesn't even have a name." They sent their rebuttal materials to the board a month later, 40 pages, photos, letters, transcripts, and the video. Always the video, the thing that never aged, never changed, never stopped being exactly what it was. Evidence, confession, proof. As the hearing date approached, the family made a decision. They would attend. All of them. Crystal, Taylor, and Andy's brother, close friends who'd become family over the years of advocacy. They would fill that room. They would make sure Keyes had to look at them while he asked for freedom. They would make sure the board saw the faces of the people he'd destroyed. And they would speak. Not with rage. They'd learned that rage could be dismissed as emotion-clouding judgment, but with clarity, with precision, with the weight of nearly 20 years of absence. And they would tell the board exactly what parole would mean, not just for Keyes, but for every other bored teenager with a phone and a stolen car, watching to see if cruelty had consequences or just waiting periods. The hearing wasn't just about one man's freedom. It was about what society was willing to tolerate, excuse, and forgive. And the Probst family intended to make sure the answer, at least this time, was nothing. The parole hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Thursday in late September, on 21 years after Andreas Probst was killed. The night before, Crystal couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through her statement in her mind, imagining the moment she'd have to look at Jesimir Keyes across a table and tell him why he should never be free. She thought about Andy, about what he would want her to say, how he would want her to carry herself. He'd always been measured, calm, even in the most heated moments. She tried to channel that. But underneath the calm was a river of grief and rage that hadn't diminished with time, only deepened. At 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep, got out of bed, and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the framed photo of Andy on his bike. "Help me get through this," she whispered to the picture. "Just one more day. Then maybe I can finally rest." The photo, of course, said nothing, but holding it steadied her. By the time the sun rose, she was ready. The hearing took place at a state facility north of Las Vegas, in a small, windowless conference room that smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. The parole board consisted of 5 members, 2 former law enforcement officers, a social worker, a retired judge, and a victim advocate. They sat on one side of a long table, files and laptops open in front of them. Keyes would sit across from them, flanked by his attorney and a prison counselor. And the Probst family was given seats along the side wall, close enough to be seen but not at the table. Crystal, Taylor, Andy's brother, and 2 close family friends filled the row. They dressed carefully, respectful but not somber, strong but not aggressive. They wanted the board to see them as credible, composed, people whose pain was real but whose judgment was sound. Across the room, a small section was reserved for Keyes' supporters, his mother, a prison chaplain, and a representative from the reentry program that had offered him a job. The 2 groups didn't make eye contact. The divide was absolute. At 9 a.m. sharp, the door opened, and Jesimir Keyes was escorted in. He was 37 now, no longer the skinny, baby-faced 16-year-old from the mugshots. He'd filled out, grown a beard, carried himself with a quiet, careful posture. He wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt, prison-issued but clean. His hands were cuffed in front of him, though the officer removed the cuffs once he was seated. Keyes glanced briefly at the Probst family, his face unreadable, then looked down at the table. The board chair, a former judge named Ellen Rodriguez, called the hearing to order. She reviewed the case briefly. Second-degree murder, sentenced to 18 years to life, minimum term served, first parole hearing. She outlined the process. Keyes would speak first, then the board would ask questions. Then the victim's family would have an opportunity to present their statement, followed by final remarks and deliberation. "Mr. Keyes," she said, looking at him directly, "this is your chance to tell us why you believe you should be released. Please proceed." Keyes took a breath and began. His voice was steady but quiet, measured. "Thank you for hearing me today. I know I don't deserve to be here asking for this. I know what I did is something I can never take back." He paused, swallowing. "I was 16 years old. I was angry, lost, looking for attention in the worst possible ways. I didn't think about consequences. I didn't think about Mr. Probst as a person. I thought about the video, the reaction, the moment. And because of that, a good man is dead. A family lost someone they loved, and I destroyed my own life and my family's life too." He looked up briefly, not at the Probsts, but at the board. "I've spent every day of the last 21 years trying to understand how I became that person. I've done therapy, I've taken classes, I've read everything I could about empathy, accountability, trauma. I'm not making excuses. I'm just trying to explain that I was broken, and I didn't even know it, and I broke other people because of it." His voice cracked slightly. "If you release me, I won't waste it. I have a job waiting. I have a plan. I want to help other kids who are where I was. Show them there's another path. I know I can't fix what I did, but I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make sure it doesn't happen again." The board asked questions about his disciplinary record, his education, his therapy, his understanding of the crime. Keyes answered each one carefully, never deflecting, never minimizing. When asked if he felt genuine remorse or just regret at being caught, he paused for a long time. "I think it started as regret," he admitted. "For a long time, I was just sorry for myself. Sorry I got caught, sorry my life was over. But somewhere in year 5 or 6, I started actually thinking about Mr. Probst, about who he was, about the fact that he woke up that morning not knowing he had minutes left to live. And that I took that from him, that I laughed about it. I think about that every single day. And it's not something I can ever make right, but it's real. The remorse is real." One board member, a former cop, leaned forward. "You filmed it. When you shared it, you made a man's death into entertainment. How do I know you're not just performing remorse now to get out?" Keyes met his eyes. "You don't," he said quietly. "You can't know for sure. All I can do is tell you the truth and let you decide if you believe me. But I'm not the same person I was. I can't be. That person was a kid. I'm not a kid anymore." Then it was the Probst family's turn. Taylor stood first, walking to the podium with a folder of notes she'd prepared. She didn't look at Keyes. She looked at the board. "My name is Taylor Probst. Andreas Probst was my father. And 21 years ago, this man and his friend turned my father's last moments into a joke." Her voice was firm, controlled. "You've heard Mr. Keyes talk about his remorse, about his growth, about how he's changed, and maybe he has. I don't know. What I do know is that my father is still dead. My mother still wakes up alone. I still have a hole in my life where he should be. And none of that changes because Mr. Keyes read some books and stayed out of trouble." She pulled out a photo of Andy and held it up. "This is who you're deciding about today. Not a case number, not a statistic. A man, a father, a husband, someone who spent 30 years protecting people. And he was killed by 2 teenagers who thought murder was content." She set the photo on the table in front of the board. "If you release Mr. Keyes, you're saying that 21 years is enough. On that filming a man's death and laughing about it is worth 2 decades, and then you get your life back. I'm asking you to consider what message that sends, not just to him, but to every other kid out there who thinks violence is entertainment." Crystal spoke next. She was older now, her hair gray, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the podium, but her voice was clear. I was married to Andy for 41 years, and I've been a widow for 21. That's half the time I had with him. I spent without him. She looked directly at Keyes now, forcing him to meet her eyes. You took that from me. You didn't just kill my husband. You killed my future. Every holiday, every anniversary, every moment I should have had with him, you stole it for a video. Her voice broke and she paused, steadying herself. I don't know if you've really changed. Maybe you have. But I do know this. My husband believed in consequences. He believed that people had to be held accountable for what they did, and not just for who they became later, and I'm asking you to honor that, to honor him, by making sure that the people who killed him don't get to walk free while he's still in the ground. She stepped back, and Taylor put an arm around her as they returned to their seats. The room was silent. The board deliberated for 30 minutes in a separate room while everyone waited. It was the longest 30 minutes of Crystal's life. She sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. Taylor paced quietly in the hallway. Keyes sat at the table, head down, hands clasped. Finally, the board returned. Chair Rodriguez looked at Keyes, then at the family, then down at her notes. Mr. Keyes, this board has reviewed your file, your testimony, and the statements from the victim's family. We acknowledge the significant progress you've made during your incarceration. Your disciplinary record is clean. Your educational achievements are commendable. Your participation in rehabilitative programs is extensive. She paused. However, this board must also consider the nature of the offense, the premeditation, the callousness, the fact that you filmed and shared the crime. These factors indicate a level of depravity that, while it may have been rooted in adolescence, resulted in the intentional death of an innocent man. She looked at him directly. This board has decided to deny parole at this time. Crystal exhaled, a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. Taylor closed her eyes, tears streaming silently down her face. Rodriguez continued. You will be eligible for another hearing in 5 years. We encourage you to continue your programs and to demonstrate sustained remorse and accountability. But at this time, the board does not believe you have adequately mitigated the severity of your offense. Keyes nodded slowly, his face blank. He'd expected it, maybe. Or maybe he'd hoped, and hope had just died. He was let out without a word. The Probsts sat in stunned, exhausted relief. It wasn't over. Keyes would have more hearings, and eventually, maybe in another 10 or 15 years, a board might say yes. Ayala's hearing would come in 2 years, and they'd have to do this all over again. But today, justice had held. Today, the board had remembered. Today, Andy's life still mattered more than his killer's redemption. And for now, that was enough. Outside, Crystal stood in the parking lot, staring at the sky. It was the same clear, bright blue as the morning Andy had ridden his bike for the last time. Taylor stood beside her, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Crystal said quietly, "He would have been proud of us." Taylor nodded. "Yeah, he would." They got in the car and drove home, carrying the weight of 21 years and the knowledge that they'd have to carry it for however many more years remained. Justice, they'd learned, wasn't a destination. It was a practice. A choice made over and over in courtrooms and parole hearings and quiet moments of grief, to insist that actions have weight, that cruelty has consequences, that a man's life, a good man's life, meant something. They couldn't bring Andy back, but they could make sure the world never forgot him. And as long as they were alive, they would. One hearing at a time, one day at a time, until the very end.